Here we go, we are back for this afternoon for all our audiences who are following up for the second day of the Carbon Pricing Conference. We just enter in the pitch session after a lunch break. So welcome everyone to join us at this moment. We are live stream from Paris, local time. And now we are going to have a smart pitch from another startup, Saint-Élion. Please just share with us the content of Saint-Élion. You're back on the pitch series 5. You're back on the pitch series 5. You're going to be part of the new leaders to raise up a new generation of entrepreneurs. Here we go, we'll listen to you. Cheers.
Hello, I am Carmen from Synhelion, and I would like to tell you how Synhelion decarbonizes transportation. Let's start with a big number. The aviation industry consumes 300 million tons of fuel per year. We all know that we need to get CO2 emissions to zero to stop global warming. The easiest way to do so is to replace fossil fuels with carbon-neutral fuels. We don't need to change the whole infrastructure, we just need to fuel up our planes with clean fuels. And that's exactly what Synhelion does. We have developed a technology that turns CO2, water and sunlight into synthetic fuels. This may sound like magic to you, but it's actually quite logical. When you burn a fuel, CO2 is released. We take that CO2 and turn it back into fuel. So let me show you how it works. In this video, you can see a solar tower and a mirror field. These mirrors focus the sunlight onto the top of the tower and generate process heat beyond 1500 degrees. We use this heat to drive our reactor that turns CO2 and water into syngas. And syngas is then further processed into fuel. We can produce any type of fuel, such as jet fuel for planes, diesel for trucks, or gasoline for cars. Solar fuels have the potential to cover multiple times global fuel demand. Countries like the United States, Australia, Argentina, or Saudi Arabia alone could produce enough fuels to cover global demand. This is a huge market opportunity. So by now, you're probably wondering where we currently stand in our development. We proved our technology on lab scale in 2014 at ETH Zurich, and under real field conditions in 2019 in a small and in a medium-sized plant. We are now further scaling up our technology and plan to build our first industrial plant next year. This plant will already produce a few hundred liters of fuel per day. By 2030, we can cover half of Switzerland's jet fuel demand with our climate-friendly fuels. And by 2040, we can supply half of Europe's jet fuel demand. This is how solar fuels move the world toward net zero. If you would like to know more about Synhelion, please get in touch at info@synhelion.com subscribe to our newsletter, or follow us on LinkedIn and on Twitter. Thank you.
Here we are back after the Synelion pitch, and I hope that you enjoy not only the speed demo and their project, but also to understand what they are behind the application and the impact to go ahead in the net zero target. So we are going to have a very smart break session just after this introduction, because at the end of the day, all the dedicated session after will be tailor-made on data, tailor-made on carbon offsetting, and then closing these 2 special days by the Climate Tech Awards itself, to design the 2 nominees we would like to highlight, to bootstrap, to support, to fulfill, and to invest. So keep in touch. We are going just to have a very smart break and be back soon, in a few minutes.
YouTube lo damos por abandonado.
Lo de YouTube lo damos por... Es una buena pregunta, yo. Ah, ya apareció.
Nah.
Apareció el 1. Tienen un delay de transmisión del video, creo. Mira, apareció el 1. ¿El 1 cuál fue?
De la mañana.
El de la mañana, pero... Pero el 0 no está. El 0 es el que dice cultivo.
Sí, algo el link.
Tienen un problema de repertorio, como que están en una lista de espera, un pedo así.
Sí, igual están verificando que no tengas cosas
Puede ser, ¿eh?
Bueno, entonces supongamos que sí va a funcionar ese pedo.
Entonces, mira, puedo
Lo
acceder
único que falta por ver es el disco duro.
solo del disco duro, exactamente. Mañana voy a traerme otro disco duro. Y...
Igual y podemos probar con el disco duro de esta chica.
nada más conectarlo así de pura... ¿Tú traes uno? Porque este lo lee. Se llama Zoe. Zoe. ¿Sabes qué voy a hacer? Voy a cambiar estos. Mejor voy a cambiar. Estos me vamos a que se desconecten. Ah, es la misma cosa, Jorge. Para ver la cosa. Y entonces, si por alguna razón tenemos que hacer una entrevista afuera, en el otro estudio, voy a poner estas. Habrá que pensar en quitar el audio de esos videos. Entonces, mira, si por alguna razón necesitamos grabar en la otra sala, esto es...
Pero vas a tener el archivo de video, ¿no?
conecto aquí en la cámara y este lo llevamos hasta otra sala y aquí conectamos tu cámara. Con otro cable que también tengo el mismo. Si hay que ir a la sala de al lado, hacer una entrevista.
Y aquí no se hace nada.
O sea que en vez de que sea este plató, en vez de plató sería una entrevista ya. El problema es el audio. Entonces en ese caso tú tendrías que conectar tu micrófono a tu cámara. Igual habría que montarlo y solamente conectarlo en el caso de HDMI. Esta es la cámara.
¿Y está muy lejos el otro plató?
No, aquí afuera, en la parte de la sala está como abierta.
Ay, no alcanza el cable de audio.
No sé. No estoy seguro. Como mide como 10 metros. Va a llegar por ahí. Bueno, sí podría ponerlo. ¿Por qué? ¿Es problema con el micrófono? Qu'est-ce que c'est? Ah, tu laisses yo. Bon, quelque chose déjà. Tiens, tant qu'à faire, je vais le connecter dans mon truc pour voir cette histoire de. Il fait combien? Un téra ou combien?
Il me semble 2, je sais pas, c'est Fabrice qui l'a acheté hier, donc regardez.
Ah, c'est pas ton disque, là je suis en train de vérifier un truc.
Ouais.
Mais il ne le voit pas. C'est bizarre. Donc maintenant, je vais le connecter nativement.
And help tries to offset.
C'est un câble spécial. Donc, comme ça.
In the market because it's
Great.
Sí, más o menos, que es lo que puede durar un año. Y luego por ahí, mira, vamos a ver de este lado. ¿Qué cuadro puede estar chido?
everybody.
Here we go. We are back in this special session of the Carbon Pricing Conference dedicated to data analytics, text, and the space angle to drive forces to better understand what could be the carbon footprint, what could be the biodiversity footprint in our industrial activities. First of all, I would like to introduce my distinguished panelists from today. And starting probably with you, Rick, by Trucost by Standard Poor's, and to have a smart presentation for your side to introduce yourself in 30 seconds, 1 minute, and after going around all the panelists and starting the first question, the first issue we're going to address in this hour. Yes, please, Rick, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Good afternoon, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Rick Ward. I'm the Head of Methodology Innovation at Trucost, which is part of S&P Global and our new Sustainable One division. My background is in environmental economics, but I've been working with companies and investors on climate and ESG-related topics for around 10 years now. For those who don't know, Trucost is a specialist data provider. We track around 15,000 global companies in terms of their environmental and carbon performance and provide that data to many investors. They use it in their benchmarking and their own reporting. But we also provide some more advanced analytic services around climate risk and environmental risk, including things like transition risk for companies, physical risks, and the transition to the green economy. A lot of my work at the moment is focused around our physical risk offering.
This introduction. I'm going to be back now with Jérôme Tarasca from the Carbon Disclosure Project. Yes, please, Jérôme, the floor is yours.
Hi, Fabrice. Hi, everyone. Nice to be here with you. Thank you for the invitation. I'm Jérôme Tarasca. I'm working in the capital markets team of CDP Europe. And I'm working with financial institutions, particularly in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, to accompany them in their journey towards a low carbon economy. I am myself, I have an experience in financial research, but I also launched a startup, a responsible startup a few years ago in Paris. So I appreciate the event focusing as well on startups and tech. CDP is we have started that about 20 years ago, and it's mandated by about 600 financial institutions requiring standardized data that can be compared from a company to another. And then this data is being used by many different actors, including Trucost, and including these 600 financial institutions I mentioned. We do have work, obviously, focusing on climate, and so on the, I would say, carbon pricing, among other things. But we also focusing more and more on biodiversity. So thank you for inviting me on this panel. And just to add, my focus currently is really much on science-based target and trying with investors to drive emission reduction in the real economy.
Yes, thanks, Jérôme, for this brief introduction. Now I'm going to be back to introduce Tommy Rickett from B0 Carbon, the CEO and co-founder of B0 Carbon. Yes, please, Tommy, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Great to be here, and thanks for inviting me to speak. So I'm Tommy Ricketts. I'm the CEO and co-founder of B0 Carbon. We're a one-year-old startup based in London that's sort of growing very fast as the economy sort of booms in the climate space. My background is I spent 5 years working in politics and policy, including a stint as a stagiaire in the European Parliament for the European Greens. I then spent 5 years at Bank of America, being originally the UK equity strategist during Brexit, which was a disrupting time as a former stagiaire in the European Parliament, and then followed by working in New York as the global investment strategist, so really sell-side research. And I launched B0 a year ago to really, at a macro level, prove that you can link environmental or ecological prosperity with economic prosperity. They're not a contradiction, they're actually mutually aligned. And the business itself, we're trying to be quite ambitious and build what we're calling CALM, climate asset liability management. So we actually work across the decarbonization space, net zero strategies, carbon neutral strategies, and the sort of data that Rick might pick up on for some of the companies. We also do science-based targeting, etc., and use the CDP analysis. So it's very interesting there. On the asset side, we actually work in natural capital. So this idea of biodiversity moving beyond carbon into ecosystem services, we're very much focused on. And in between, just to be particularly greedy, we've invented a system called the B0 Carbon Ratings Framework, which is a little bit like the S&P rating system, but for the voluntary offset market. So really very ambitious and working very hard in this space. And thanks.
Of all your remarks that beyond text and data, starting from this point that science-based is not far from our scheme. Let's back now to our also distinguished panelist, Sydney Lobo. Sydney from Mumbai. Yes, please, Sydney, just introduce you, or for people who just not have you on the previous session, introduce yourself. The floor is yours, Sydney.
Thanks, Fabrice, and hello to all of you guys. Depending on where you are, it's morning, evening, or afternoon. So just a hello. My name is Sydney Lobo, and I'm speaking from Mumbai in India. I've been in the energy business for more than about 25 years in the corporate world, in the hydrocarbon sector, and then also subsequently in the power utility sector. I've been working in the R&D space, developing technologies and evaluating futuristic technologies. Was part, and I'm still working with one of the AI/ML companies from Canada in looking at certain AI/ML solutions for utilities. Post October 2020, got out of the corporate world, and now I'm working with startups as a senior advisor. Mentoring different startups and trying to utilize my years of experience in the clean tech space and helping the young blood to help them commercialize their technologies, because it's the need of the hour that these new technologies need to come on the ground and get commercial at the earliest. So that's quick about my background. Thank you.
Thanks, Sydney. I'm going to introduce the panel by asking for you, yes, Tommy. What is the purpose of the data when it comes to carbon accounting for your side?
Great question. I think first things first, take a step back and say what is carbon data? Greenhouse gas emissions are generated by creating and moving things predominantly. So actually what you're looking at across the business is those sort of activities, which is why when you do carbon accounting, actually you typically can work with most sectors, because if you think about it in sort of basic physics and engineering terms, it doesn't really matter if you're a cashmere company or you're a financial services company. And then the data is really important for us we have this idea of radical accountability, that you should be responsible for all scopes of all of your emissions, and we try to calculate them as best possible. But so the integrity of that data is super important, not least because you're trying to diagnose your liability accurately, but also ultimately this is about reducing your emissions, and you need high quality data in order to say what are the sources of my emissions and where can I be addressing my carbon hotspots. So I say, for that regard, the data for us is it's the instrument, if you will, from which you can play the rest of the tune, and without it you can't really do very much.
And just to follow up with this, your remark, Tommy, and address to also the other panelists about the availability of the data. If all it's about accounting, but about also the integrity and the availability of the key data that we have to target before reporting something. What is, Tommy, your point of view of the availability, so the accessibility to this data? And then I'm going to share this same question with our other panelists.
I think, again, a very good question. Patchy would be my answer, and also very country dependent. I mean, in the UK, they publish these things called the greenhouse gas carbon conversion factors. So it's a nationally published sort of data bank, which is really helpful. And there's one in the US which is about the energy system, which is quite helpful. There is something you can get hold of if you ask the Swiss government. I think there's a little bit of stuff in the French administration you can get hold of, but generally speaking, you then have to rely on international benchmarks. So from a national perspective, it's starting to move that way, but it's not anywhere near as developed as it should be. From a company perspective, I think it's the single biggest challenge when talking about decarbonization is the collection of the data. The calculation of it is not that difficult in my view, especially if you've got statistical engineers working on it. But we call it collect, cut, and communicate. That's our 3 C's of decarbonization. And I was very specifically said collect, because the majority of it is trying to figure out who in the business will have this data and how to get hold of it. So I say there are 2 sides. One, it's very patchy at an institutional level. You can buy SEMA Pro, which is sort of the best thing that we would use. But at a company level, I don't know if you know this old quote, but Kissinger used to say, who do you call when you call Europe? As a sign of saying there is no universal leader there. It's a little bit like this for who do you call when you want to talk about climate? There's no one person typically at a business that can give you all those answers. So that's what I'd say.
Yes, thanks, Tommy. And I'm going to ask the same question to Rick Law from S&P about the availability of the data.
Sure. Yeah, I think I definitely very much agree with Tommy. I think maybe taking the sort of data provider's perspective, I think for many years, the availability of data at the company level on emissions reporting has been pretty patchy. It's definitely improved in recent years with the introduction of TCFD and some more rigorous carbon regulation reporting requirements in some countries. But in many cases, companies might disclose only some of their emissions for some scopes, but not a comprehensive picture. And for many of the investors we work with, what they really need is a complete picture of the carbon emissions profile of all of the companies they invest in, which may be many thousands, but also the many thousands of companies in the benchmarks that they compare themselves against. And so having a complete data set that is universally comparable and complete over time is really a key thing. And so that's really where Trucos was born around 20 years ago, which was to try to solve that problem. And we've grown over the many years to now be collecting data on about 15,000 public companies, so most of the listed companies in the world. We collect that, anything that the companies disclose, whether it be their actual emissions or their fuel use, electricity use, and so on. And then we can normalize that into standardized carbon metrics that everybody's familiar with and bring in data, for example, from the CDP as well. And then where companies don't disclose data, we can make a best estimate of their emissions based on the activities they're involved in. And so that allows us to produce a complete picture of the environmental performance of different companies. And I think as we go along, more and more companies are going to be pressured to release more accurate carbon data. And I think the role of the data provider will shift away from just collating and standardizing some of these carbon data points to the more advanced analyses that maybe connect that carbon emissions profile to more investor-relevant financial metrics.
Rick, for this, and going in this field about the availability of the data, I'm going to ask the same question, but in another sense for Jérôme Tarasca from CDP. Do you think that those data should be like an open data set, or what can we deal with this? Quite the same question, just we follow up with Rick with this question and follow up to Jérôme then.
Yeah, thanks, Fabrice. It's a great question. First of all, it's a challenge to collect data in a standardized way, as Rick said, and it takes a lot of work and effort. So CDP has been working on this for 20 years now, and our goal is to have standardized data so that you can compare emissions across all scopes between companies. When we do that, and we work with, last year, for example, nearly 10,000 companies disclosed to CDP. It represents about half of the global market capitalization, reporting carbon data, among other data, to CDP. When we do that, we encourage companies to disclose this data publicly. And as a result of this effort, CDP is an NGO, a non-for-profit organization. And so when we encourage them to disclose this data publicly, and as a result of that, about 50% of companies disclosing data can be found online publicly. Now, you can find data, you can find GHG emissions for a specific company, but if you want to make a professional use of this data and create products based on this or resell this data, then CDP is trying to finance itself by reselling this data. And the reason of that is because the collection of this data is a huge work. We have teams in China, we have teams in India, in Southeast Asia, in America, North America, Latin America, in Europe, in Africa, in order to work with companies, accompany them in their journey to report their emissions. So it takes a lot of effort. So thinking that, I would say, carbon data or other environmental data is free is also not taking into account that this data de facto has a cost of collection as it is now, due to the fact that it's not uniform and it takes effort and education to help companies provide this information. Now, an interesting perspective of that is that, as we heard, I think Trucos is doing a tremendous work in increasing the universe of companies with data, even for companies that do not disclose data. I would just like to precise here that out of all the companies working with CDP, there's still a large number of companies that do not disclose data, and for which we have to estimate greenhouse gas emissions. And we work year on year with companies that do not disclose the emission in a standardized manner to try to push them to do that, because it's the first step, in our opinion, for managing their impact. You can only manage what you can measure. So let's start by measuring together. And as you talked about standard way to collect data, what we rely on, we're not a standard setter at CDP, but we use standards that are widely used internationally. And so we work with the GHG protocol that gives clear guidelines and recommendations as to how can a company report their emission in a standardized way internationally.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks, Jérôme. We have discussed about the availability of the data, the transparency, not far from this.
Fabrice, you're on mute.
Yes. Hold on. Do you hear me? Is it okay?
Yes.
Oh, yeah,
yes.
Thanks. So we have just discussed about the availability of the data, the transparency of those is not far a far topic. I would like to highlight not only the data set and to collect, and the voluntary also implementation by companies themselves to go in this field to collect and have their own footprint, and the benchmark that you drive also is very important, and a track record one. I would like to go inside the box because the engine to process the data, the tech, the AI is also important. We are in a world of massive information, and I would like to ask this question, yes, with you, Sydney. Do you think that we have also to better understand the analytics and make much more transparency on the analytics, or it could be also tricky because it's like an IP, it's like an asset for companies who have those technologies? What do you think, Sydney, on your point of view?
So thanks, Fabrice. Interesting, and I'll keep this question a little aside, but I will like to bring a point to the first question that you put up to us. And as Tommy mentioned, Rick mentioned that it's patchy, and Rick also mentioned that some countries do have a compulsion that, they should publish their data. I think the root cause of all this is that CO2 emissions or carbon emissions are not statutorily mandated. If you look at any industry across the globe, they would have to file permits for the SPM, for the suspended particulate matter that they emit, for the oxides of sulfur that they emit, for the nitrous oxides that they emit, for the carbon monoxide that they emit. And there is a statutory limit that this is the maximum that you can emit for a specific type of industry for the process. Now, there is a statutory requirement as a result of which the industries file their so-called permits and say that this is my limit, this is what I have done. And it's available with the so-called pollution control boards or pollution control departments. But nowhere is anybody saying that you have to disclose your CO2 emissions, be it scope 1, scope 2, or scope 3. It's not mandated anywhere. It's always voluntary. And I think that's the challenge everybody faces when it's voluntary, to get it out of the system or to get it out of these industries. As I think Tommy mentioned, right? There's no one person that you can go to and tell that, okay, what's your overall CO2 emission in the industry? They may not tell you. But if it is mandatory that you have to disclose it, then that makes a difference that they will have to disclose their CO2 emissions. Now, whether they are authentic, whether they are accurate is a secondary question. But at least those numbers mandatorily will be out on the website or in the open forum. So that is something which is required. I'm not saying that there has to be a threshold, that this is the limit that you can, emit. Otherwise, even for you and me as human beings, we'll have to set a limit because we are exhaling CO2. Okay. So I'm not saying put a limit, but make it mandatory that you have to disclose your CO2 emissions, and it has to be statutory. So that's when the data will come out. Now coming to the analytics part, data is the so-called, it's a big ocean. Analytics is utilized to analyze that data for a specific goal. I mean, you may utilize the entire data to, do analytics of the trends. You may utilize the data package to look at, do certain predictive analysis. So the entire AI engine will do some predictive analysis, and, it can only analyze the data. So it's always a lag indicator. It's, the data is factual. It's what is coming out of your actions and whatever you do. Based on that data, one would utilize algorithms to do various analysis based on a certain end result that one is trying to look at. So that's where the analytics part comes into play. Thank you.
And I would like now to come with Tommy with this question. Do you think that the regulation now has to go on another level so as to cope with what said Sydney, or do you think it's too early? But as the net zero target is very impressive to match and the time is running, do you think that the regulation and a very impactful regulation could be helpful for everyone indeed?
So, a great question. So the UK has introduced this year for the very first time the streamlined energy and carbon reporting framework, which makes it mandatory for companies with either two of these three. I think it's $36 million in revenue, 18 million pounds in book or on their balance sheet, and 250 or more employees. So there's a little booming mini economy right now in SECR, as it's called, responses. And my understanding from friends in Westminster is that that's going to increase. And so roughly speaking, that's about 10,000 companies out of 6 million in the UK, but obviously the largest. And if that increases to the next bucket down, that would be probably 40,000. So I think you're starting to see that trend emerge. And it's kind of very correlated to the severity of the net zero target. How legal is that? Is it a target? Just like some companies are setting targets, or is it a mandated piece of legislation? And I think France is very strong. Obviously lots of other European countries on this. So there is evidence of it happening, and that's typically a way of countries showing that they're making corporate activity kind of count. But it's obviously just the start of a process. And I think the other side to this is what forces companies to change if regulations are not doing it. Well, it's what do the capital markets think? And actually I think it's 35% of MSCI ACWI companies are now doing this on their own. And the biggest driver of that is investor demand or ultimately consumer demand. So I think companies ultimately will have to be ahead of regulations, although I think regulations will start to come in big kind of steps as opposed to a gradual increase, because it's been demanded of them by investors in a way which never had happened before. In the rise of ESG and the data that the colleagues here are helping create. So in short, regulations is part of the answer. I think markets will already do a lot of its job for them, but certainly I'm not aware of any other countries where it's law for their large companies to report. But even then, as you were saying, it's only scope 1 and scope 2. So it's not like they're going far enough as far as we're concerned. So the more regulations, the better. But ultimately, it's about creating, as Sydney said, the idea that it's mandatory to report.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's a good introduction to the other point I would like to address. Thanks, Tommy. To Rick. Do you think, Rick, that companies have to anticipate the regulation from now and design internally a strategy to set up an internal carbon price so as to anticipate, in fact, the probably something which is not by a voluntary approach, but by a constraint. So they have to adapt and to be on the game player in 1 decade or ahead. They have to anticipate this thing and to put a price directly in other product, in other accountancy. Do you think, Rick, that companies have to do it from now, not to wait the regulation is coming to push them in this direction?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And maybe just briefly to comment on the previous question as well around the importance of regulation. I think absolutely I agree. Regulation is really important to push companies towards disclosing more and being more transparent. We've seen that a lot amongst our clients in France, where there's been a huge requirements put on investor clients, but also companies to begin disclosing more. But I think on the other side, there's a lot of private sector initiatives that are really pushing companies as well. So one that comes to mind is the Glasgow Alliance Financial Service Alliance for Net Zero, which is signed up to by around 30 or so of the largest financial institutions. And so that's them essentially committing to understanding their emissions and reducing them towards net zero over time. And that's particularly interesting because obviously for financial actors, what they really need to be working on is their investments and then the companies that they finance in terms of their lending activities. So it puts a lot of pressure on those companies to try to reduce their emissions over time. On the question of carbon pricing, I think it's a really interesting topic, and we work both with individual companies, but also with investors on the topic. With companies, we generally see there's a recognition that carbon pricing is going to become more stringent over time. They can see governments moving in that direction, even if it hasn't happened yet in the particular sector and country where they operate. And so companies are often very interested in trying to understand how high could carbon prices go in the future from a regulatory perspective. And if they do go that high, what would be the impact on my financial position for the company? So how does that impact my expenses, my margins, and overall my earnings in the long run? So we work with companies often on that question. And as part of that, we'll often help them to think about, if we were to set an internal carbon price, what level should we set that price at? And then how do we implement that to try to change the way the company makes decisions and allocate capital to the kinds of projects and activities that would reduce their emissions over time. Similarly, I think when we work with investors, they're obviously looking a little bit from a higher level, I guess. They're looking across many companies, but they want to understand the same kinds of things. So how would my portfolio be impacted from an earnings perspective through carbon pricing? And then how can I engage with those investee companies to try to help them to improve their performance over time?
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Rick. Just to to also to make the connection and with Jérôme. Do you think, Jérôme, there is now a new championship that now the target is not only to make some pledges to say we will be as an organization, public and private, to be net zero. It's not only the purpose for the private sector. To make the connection with Rick, the purpose of Rick is now there is a new championship. It's not only about your value on the stock exchange. It's also about the value of your work to be net zero. And saying this, the championship and the rules are not the same. So as we are in a voluntary process today, so the regulation to be net zero is not here from now, do you think that now it's an open door, an open championship when and where the fast mover will be the next leader, and the slower, even if you are big today, you will be not part of the piece on the world of net zero tomorrow. Do you think, how do you propose another angle to your point of view on this? Is there?
Yeah, I mean, your question is interesting. I think the value of company is already being changed by the exposure to emissions, and companies have understood that because more and more companies disclose their emissions, not only because they are mandatory requirements, like in Europe through the ETS scheme and the soon to come the CSRD regulation, so a regulation that will ask all companies in Europe, independent of their size, to report their emission. So this is currently a proposal with the European Commission. So all companies have already understood that. And why have they understood that? Because there's different stakeholders asking them to care about this, including investors, as Rick said, including their clients. They also see their peers moving. There's regulators pushing. So it's a consortium of action. And reporting emission is just a first step, but it's just a picture of where your company is at in terms of exposure. But what do you do next? So next is, well, you try to take measures to reduce this exposure so that your value, the value of your company in the future, won't be impacted. So investors care about that because they could, the investment could be impacted. So there at CDP, we identify a few, I would say, best practices or good action to try to reduce these exposures for the companies themselves. And it's setting an internal carbon price is one of them, because we published actually last month a report on carbon pricing. It's available on the conference website. I invite everyone to have a look at it, because it details that, first of all, the number of companies using an internal carbon pricing has kept raising in the past 5 years, almost double in 5 years. So it's really something that is growing. We can see that about half of the largest companies in the world have an internal carbon pricing. And why do they do that? Well, when they disclose this information to CDP, and about 6,000 companies disclosed this information to CDP, they say that it helps them dedicate effort to low carbon investments. So having a carbon pricing helps them focusing on low carbon investment. It helps them, secondly, drive energy efficiency measures. And second, it changes internal behavior. So that everyone can actually capture this information in a monetary way. And what is interesting in this report that is based on empirical data reported by companies is that we can find that there is a strong correlation between companies having an internal carbon pricing and companies having ambitious emission reduction targets. Ambition reduction targets, sometimes even validated by independent bodies like the Science Based Target Initiative. So it's correlated, and it's correlated with claims and I would say transition plan to be net zero by a time frame consistent with the Paris Agreement, so net zero by 2050 or before. So these measures and these actions are correlated. They are part of best measures that can be put in place by high emitters, but not only, by the whole economy. And yeah, it's interesting to see that there is a movement in place, and we need this, I would say, external independent assessment to ensure that these are not just false claims, that they are actually in line with what science tells us. And I think once there will be, and there is already, we can see more than 1,400 companies working with the Science Based Target Initiative and setting ambitious reduction targets, but it still has to be more. The whole economy has to set science-based target and align themselves to the Paris Agreement. So that's the reason why, for example, at CDP, we launched an engagement campaign for investors to take part of, and which is currently in its second year, where investors are asking large emitters to set 1.5 degree science-based targets. And this is, to my knowledge, the largest campaign of the sort, because 1,800 companies that are targeted, and it's been backed by nearly 140 financial institutions and representing nearly $20 trillion of assets. So there is a clear direction, a clear drive from investors, but not only, for different stakeholders, to take action, to ask companies to take action and take ambitious reduction targets, put an internal price on carbon, disclose their emission, and get these emissions validated independently, audited, so that we have a good base to work with.
Thanks, Jérôme. And to have a real overview of this field, we are going also to share with you, all of us and you, our panelists, a message from Laurence Monnet-Smith. She is the head of sustainability of CNES in France, CNES, which is the National Space Agency, and she's going to drive us an overview on the climate from space and what can the space provide us to monitor all this data and to produce new data, newcomers enterprise, new startups who are going to catch up the link between clean tech, climate tech, and also space tech. So we're going to share with you his exclusive interview. Hi everyone, we are back with Laurence Monnet-Smith from the CNES. The CNES is a French special agency. Laurence she's an advisor on the presidency dedicated to climate issue, and we are very, very pleased to welcome you on this specific panel according to the data, the tech, the analytics, and what can the space could provide and help us monitor the environment, monitor the climate, but not also. So yes, Laurence, we are very pleased to welcome you and let you introduce your purpose.
Hello, very, very nice and very pleased to be with you. Actually, I'm also head of sustainable development and performance at CNES, not an advisor. So I'm very I'm very happy to be with you and to share some ideas and some facts about how actually space and special agencies, the work of special agencies around the world is helping to fight against climate change.
What do you think that the space could have already provide to help us to monitor the environment, and how can space could help us better take care of the impact of our industrial activities on this environment, which is the most powerful carbon sink, the natural carbon sink?
Well, we've been working for a while with the international community and engineers within space agencies around the world. The international program, which is called Global Climate Observing System, has been created in 1982, roughly, and has been working with the within the frame of the UNFCCC to help to define some criteria, what we call essential climate variables, to define them and with this definition to modelize the climate and to monitor its evolutions. When you think about it, so 1982, this was the beginning of climate observation through new instruments installed on satellites. And with this group, the observing system, we have defined over 50 essential climate variables. Of course, they had to answer to some very specific criteria, like technically available, economically accessible for the main countries, and very important to characterize the evolution of the climate. And when you have all these criteria together, on this over 50 criteria, more than 26 can only be observed from space, which means that the role of space agencies, the role of engineers and scientists working with us is really extremely important to characterize the evolution. So this has been since 1982, roughly, and now since that time, since the middle of the 1960s, had more than 50 satellites that have been used throughout the time, and addressing this global observing system, which has been the base for all the research, the main research that has been done within the UNFCCC and the IPCC frame.
Yes, you mentioned, and you're greatly highlight that you're not also a climate advisor, but the head of sustainability. And when it comes to apply it in our organizations, public or private, what could the space help enterprises or public organization to better manage, to have the quality of the data, to better manage their impact on environment, specifically probably the private sector?
Well, space has done a lot, especially at the European level, because we've developed at the European level the Copernicus system. I'm sure that a lot of you have heard about that. And the Copernicus system is the follow-up of the first program that has been launched in collaboration between France and the US with the TOPEX Poseidon program, which was measuring at the sea level. So we were very famous, and we have been working a lot on altimetry, what we call altimetry. And Copernicus is a European program that has been developed for now more than 20 years, and the satellites are offering images and data on open source to everyone, every countries in the world. So that's the gift, the European gift to the world, because those data measure actually sea level, measure lots of, lots of variables, what some of them I've mentioned before. And they can be used by any, not only any companies, but any government which is developing its own policy in environment, whatever the topic. So we are measuring deforestation, some species, how they evolve, where they are, how they reproduce, what we can see. So many variables. Those data are open to everyone through portals, and there that are provided to companies and to any public entity. For example, there are climate service, which is called CEST, climate change service, which is a huge portal where everybody can find data and use case about climate change on their own, and even on their own region, on their own, because those data are available everywhere in the world, from every continent. I mean, you can find information and data to any cities in the world. So you can measure climate change, you can measure biodiversity, you can also measure, you also have an alert system for major disaster, but I can talk about that a bit later if you want. And you have data about meteorology as well. So all those data are open and free and accessible to everyone. I'm not saying that they're easy to use. One might need an expertise, or their companies can help you to define the product you might need, but they exist, and we pretty much are the only area in the world providing such information globally, recurrently to everyone.
So it's a good point, Laurence, to highlight that we see that space is a provider, is the infrastructure of the data providing, a massive data providing. When it comes to those data, it's all about the data of everywhere on the climate or environment impact. So it comes on public goods or common goods. How can we, you mentioned the framework of the open data, yours. So from your perspective, do you think that today, with the new space, they would have other models, not only public or open data, but also some key data who could be very important to have, but they wouldn't be public, they probably be private. So when it comes to the climate, to the environment, how can we deal and align with those issues on the model development and the investment before and the common good, as we highlight now with the new also administration in US, the common good. How can we deal with this?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. Europe has implemented an open infrastructure, making sure that we can all have access. Maybe there are minor exceptions linked to defense and securities, but basically all these data linked with climate change or biodiversity are accessible to everyone. Nevertheless, you're right. The development of microsatellites or constellations that are launched by private companies might jeopardize this issue. I'm not as I would say that I'm not afraid or scared by the fact that scientific data will be private. I think the international scientific community linked with Earth observation, the group on Earth observation, for example, who's the major alliance at the international level of academics linked with research on climate change issues, are extremely active in making sure that those data are accessible to everyone, provided to everyone. And to be honest with you, I don't think a private company will be interested in monitoring climate and making those data private. And you know why? It's because it's extremely expensive and nobody is really paying for it. So it is a public good paid by states or groups of states or by bilateral cooperation. What I'm more interested in, or what I'm more, cautious about, are not necessarily those data, but more specific data that can be, because where the added value of those scientific data is in the specific treatment that you can do on it, and crossing those spatial data, space data, with other type of data, and that's where you're creating value. And this is obviously a business, and because you need, if you want to sell this information, well, it can be very interesting, for example, for a city or for a company to exactly have an idea of what's going to happen in the next 10 years. For example, if you want to build a city and you want exactly know how if you're on the coastline, what's the climate's going to be and how the sea level is going to rise, and you want to know what will be the impact of this sea rise on the infrastructure you're building. Well, this space can tell you, but it's not enough. You need to work on a model. I'm talking about that because that's one of the projects of the Space Climate Observatory. And
we have some.
And this
yes,
work
okay.
on the data needs a lot of modelization, artificial intelligence, algorithm, you name it. And this work on data, not only you need to have the open data, but you also need a specific treatment on this data, and this is going to be sold. Well, how are we going to be sure that, how are we going to make happen that all the most vulnerable countries will have access to this? Because one cannot, public research cannot, and it's not their job to work on this more specific platform or information that you can have from the data. And you need a business model to do that in order to improve it. So that's what we're doing in the Space Climate Observatory, financing projects like that and making sure that private companies, for example, will be able to maintain those modelization and to share it with vulnerable countries. So that's kind of, hybrid model we're trying to invent, because working on data needs knowledge, needs expertise, and not everyone can do it. So you need kind of public-private model to provide that to some countries. Some countries can pay for it, some areas cannot pay for it. So we're trying to organize this public-private mix that not some are paying for it, but we also share. So that's what I'm more, cautious about, because I think that sovereign data, like the one that can modelize climate, will not in a short period of time will be privatized. I don't think so. You have to think about the price of the instruments that are installed on the satellite. They cost an absolute fortune, and I don't see a private company doing it.
So it's a good conclusion, Laurence, that you have allied, and in fact you have co-designed with us in this talk what is sustainability, what could be a head of sustainable the perspective, but a global perspective. It's all about sustainable public and private partnership. It wouldn't be only public, it wouldn't be pure private. It's about co-building from public and private sustainability we want. And data is in the core reactor, the core engine with the analytics to make it happen. So let's go ahead with the scientifics, the tech people, and also the public policies to support this framework, also for countries who have not the capability or the infrastructure to make it, because we live in one world. So I'm very pleased, and we are very pleased to welcome you, Laurence Moignier-Smith, from the CNES, the French Space National Agency, and very pleased to go ahead in this field very soon on the carbon pricing conference. So thanks a lot, Laurence, and keep tuned.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye.
Yes, we are back now for this link from the space, from the carbon, and now from the... Do you hear me? Is it okay? Everyone hear me? Okay, thanks. We are back in now with the overview of the space industry. What can we put in place from climate, from carbon data, now also with the biodiversity? I would like now to address with Tommy. Do you see a direct connection from space and your job, according to the biodiversity footprint to monitor? What can we deal with this, not only on the carbon accounting, but on the biodiversity accounting?
Sure. So absolutely, there's a very important role to play, and interesting to hear Laurent's comments about, I think roughly half of the types of climate emissions can be observed spatially or via space. So that's really interesting. On biodiversity, look, there are two ways to think about assessing ecosystem services, if you will, biodiversity, pollination, water systems, climate change, etc. One is from the ground up, so physically testing sequestration on the ground and measuring, monitoring it, either for companies or literally through the nature-based solutions. The other one is from satellite imagery or GIS assessments. So you can start to model and project environmental change and returns, and what's happening, whether that's biodiversity, whether that's canopy coverage, whether that's levels of sequestration. But I do think that they're mutually beneficial, and you should, spatial or space-based technology, in order to understand climatic or environmental changes, is only one tool. It's a very important tool, and I think it will be a very significant tool moving forward. But part of the issue with using it indiscriminately, if you will, as the only tool, is that you need to do a lot of modeling and effectively make a lot of assumptions. So you do need to keep making sure that you have that bottom-up data as well. So literally bottom-up and top-down in this instance is a very good place to start. But huge role to play, and I think that's a very growth area in the kind of startup community. You just need to go on a job website, and if you look at what the jobs are on offer are, you'll see a lot of GIS analysts. So that we've got 4 that work for us.
Thanks, Tommy. And for how can we say a macroscopic level, and the question is for you, Rick. Do you think now it's a time of convergence from carbon accounting and natural capital asset, that it means biodiversity accounting? Rick Lord from S&P.
Yeah, I think it's definitely an interesting question, and I think biodiversity is becoming more and more of a focus for a lot of investors that we work with. So not only trying to understand where their investments might well be contributing to biodiversity by understanding where those companies are operating, but actually even thinking about how they can support biodiversity through the kinds of net zero commitments that many financial institutions are making. And I think that makes it given that many of the activities that might be supporting a net zero commitment might be around reforestation or the regeneration of natural ecosystems, that brings together the idea of reducing carbon, but at the same time trying to support livelihoods and ecosystems that derive from those specific environments in the future.
Ahead in this field, and I will ask also to Sydney, do you think now there is a time of convergence, not only according to the agenda, because the COP26 is in November, the COP15 on the biodiversity Kunming is also in November. Do you think, Sydney, that there is a time of convergence, not only on the COP side, but on the topic side, that carbon issue, climate issue, and biodiversity issue, when it comes with the natural carbon sink, which is the Earth itself, it's a real time now to be net zero and to embed all these pieces in the same table, not in different table, but in the same table. What do you think on this perspective, Sydney?
Very valid point, Travis. And I think it has to be looked at it that way because, see, carbon abatement is not just one solution or not one technology can address carbon abatement. You have to look at different technologies in order to do your carbon abatement. You have to look at different sequestration opportunities, and developing a carbon sink is one of the areas which has to be looked as a natural technology package. I mean, nobody can, of course, you can do genetic engineering into plant species and things like that, but typically a plant will grow the way it has to grow. And these carbon sinks, they don't develop overnight. So it takes time. So it may take, depending upon the species that we're talking about, it may be, say, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. You know, that's where the carbon sink plays a big role, because whatever standard scientific engineering technology cannot do in terms of carbon abatement or in terms of circularity of carbon, that's what the sink will do, you know. And we have the ground as a sink. I mean, I think recently now UK has started some experiments on farmlands to try and identify as to how farmlands could become major carbon sinks. We know that, you know, forest and biodiversity areas are big sinks. So it is one of those technology packages, but it's a natural process. So that has to be looked at together and not as standalone. The other aspect of the fauna, you know, in terms of the birds and animals and all that, that is a different aspect, you know, because it encompasses into biodiversity. When we're developing a green sink, the biodiversity then grows because of these fauna coming into that space and creating a different atmosphere. I'm not saying that they are responsible or not responsible for the carbon abatement, but they do play a significant role in the entire management of the biodiversity or the natural carbon sink. So yes, it's all a package deal, and one has to look at it that way. Thank you.
To give you the open floor now, and back to Rick in 1 minute. What could be your conclusion? What you would like to share to the audience? Please, Rick.
I think maybe just as a final thought, I think the data available to try and inform decision making for many players, whether they be investors or companies, around climate, biodiversity, and many other topics, is perhaps much better now than it has ever been before, and is becoming much more available. So I think with that comes ambitious commitments from those players in the market, but also a lot of expectation for them to begin to generate a positive impact on some of these topic areas. And so I think it's a very exciting space to be working in, and I think we'll see a lot of progress made in the next 5 years or so.
Your input, Tommy, to push the limits of the purpose.
So the conclusion.
That's it.
Sure. So I think data is king. I like that line Jerome said about you can't manage unless you can measure. And I think that's very, very true. I think what's happening at the moment is, if you think about this collect, cut, and then communicate sort of pathway, the world is exploding in the diagnosis of these problems, and the services, CPD and Truecost are quite long in the tooth, 15, 20-year organizations. But what's really changed in the past 2-3 years is that idea about what do you do with it now, and how do we actually address, these underlying things through a confluence of factors. So, there's a lot of innovation and new technology coming to light. I think there's a lot more human capital coming to apply their skills to this area, and I think it's all pushing in the right direction. But certainly, the more we can do to promote that agenda, and I think I just wanted to say one thing on internal carbon pricing. I think that's a really, really important development, and we encourage it with all of our clients, because the missing bridge, and I'll leave you with this thought, between the environment and the economy is that pricing signal, and that's the really, really crucial thing here. So that's my 2 pennies.
Okay, thanks, Tommy. And now back to Jérôme. Jérôme Tarasca.
Yeah, thanks, Fabrice. My final thoughts are, I'll echo what Tommy said. So we need carbon pricing disclosed by companies, and we need regulation to make this a mandatory practice all around the world, so that the externalities related to carbon are priced by the companies themselves, and it triggers change. I like the way that you ended this session looking at biodiversity. That would be my second final thought is, I think the climate change is certainly a big topic that was in the agenda for years, but we can really see everywhere in the investment community, in the public eye, that biodiversity is a growing topic. And it's critical that it becomes a growing topic. There's a tremendous loss of biodiversity being done, around 31,000 species. Nearly 1/3 of all assessed species on the planet are threatened with extinction, so we need urgent action. I encourage companies also to start looking at their dependency and their impact on biodiversity. On CDP side, we've had for nearly 6 years now not only looked at climate and carbon footprinting and climate-related indicators, but also looked at water consumption, water pollution, and deforestation. And we want to expand this work around natural capital, as we 2 weeks ago launched a partnership with BNP Paribas Asset Management for the development of metrics, so that companies can report in a standardized manner to investors and to the public. So let's keep working in this direction. Thank you for the invitation.
Yes, thanks all my distinguished panelists, and thanks to Jérôme Tarasca from the CDP, Carbon Disclosure Project. Thanks to Sidney Lobo, former Chief Business Officer by Tata Group, Tata Power. Thanks Tommy Rickett from the CEO co-founder of B0 Carbon, and thanks also to you, Rick Lord from Truecost S&P's Global. Thanks all, and hope that the audience have enjoyed what there is behind the data, beyond the climate, carbon, and now biodiversity emerging trends data. Thanks a lot also to Laurence Moyer-Smith by remote from CNES, the National Space Agency, and just keep tuned for the next session. Thanks, bye-bye.
Thanks, Fabrice. Bye-bye.
BRGM, and before going ahead in the Climate Tech Awards, I would like to welcome with a very specific exclusive interview with Christophe Poinceau, the Deputy Chief Director of the BRGM and Scientific Director. So I will say welcome and grateful to welcome us today, Christophe.
Thank you very much. So it was our pleasure to host this on the net conference in our buildings, in our office. As you know, it's very important for us to be present on the issues related to the energy transition and the nexus between energy and climate. We are strongly involved on part of this topic, and it was our pleasure to have the chance to host you here today.
Thanks again, Christophe. BRGM is at the forefront of the net zero target by his core expertise, his background in scientific background and international well recognized. How can BRGM support new cooperation, new collaboration to public or also to private sector in this common goal?
So you're right, we are strongly involved on the net zero target. But I have to precise that we are not the sole players for sure in France, and we have a specific role. Our mission is to be the French Geological Survey, and due to this position, we are in charge of all the topics related with the underground. And the underground can play a very significant role for the energy transition, because part of the resource is there, because there is some storage issues which can be located underground. And we have also the very famous, and there was a session dedicated to that, to the carbon storage, which is a very important topic. So we are taking in charge all this topic. We are developing research, we are developing technologies, we are promoting the technologies towards the society, towards the industrial partners. And so it's a very important driver for our research, in fact. And part of the story around the energy transition is also related to the question and the issues of the natural or mineral resources. I mean, it has been very often already said, but by deploying the energy transition, we are in fact transferring from a dependence to the fossil fuels towards mineral resources, because we need a lot of mineral resources for the new low carbon technology, for the storage, for a lot of things. And so it means that it's another reason for us to be strongly involved in this topic.
It's good to hear and to notice that when it comes to climate issues, the background is very important. The underground is very important and deeply connected, in fact, much more than we expected.
Yes, for sure. It's in many countries, in fact, we are just forgetting the underground because it's not visible, probably, and so I don't know the reason for, but it's clear that we need to reinvest in this topic and to be able to study all the processes which are ongoing and which are important in order to be able to implement the global energy transition. And so that's one of our main mission. And so we are developing solutions and we are transferring the solution to the industry. That's also something which is quite important for us. And we are also developing expertise for the public bodies, whatever it is, including the government.
So thanks a lot, Christophe Poinçon, Deputy Chief Director of the BRGM and the Scientific Director of the institution. We, again, thanks for being our host today for the Carbon Pricing Conference. Hope this is the beginning of, how can we say, a task force to go ahead in this field, and see you next for the next round of the session. Thanks again.
Thank you very much. We are all on the same boat, so we need to work together.
Thanks. I know that the next Elon Musk is behind your screen. You are applied for this exceptional Climate Tech Awards. We will welcome you on this speech series last one before nominating the two ones, the best one we are going to highlight for awards. Here we go for the last but not least. Cheers!
Ok, c'est parti.
Hello, so I'm Jean-Louis Kindler. I'm the CEO at Waste2H. What we do as Waste2H is perfectly summarized in this illustration that you see here. We take waste generated by human activity and we extract hydrogen out of this waste. But very importantly, what we do is we do this in a decentralized manner. We do believe that logistics, both on the side of waste and on the side of hydrogen, is still a problem and that it needs to be addressed by localized solutions. So talking about waste, it is really important to realize that today we are literally sending about 2 billion tons worth of energy into landfills. 2 billion tons, it probably does not have much reality in most people's mind. It is the energy equivalent of about 50% of the gasoline being consumed today worldwide. So it's a massive source of energy that we can potentially turn into hydrogen. And this also is extremely important because we are today we are in the beginning of the 21st century. We are looking at a huge energy transition from fossil source energy to hydrogen. And why is that? Because hydrogen is a gas, is a source of energy that does not generate CO2. And really, this is an absolutely key element to realize that we can use today, we have the potential to use this waste that is a problem to humanity and extract the hydrogen that is contained in that waste to generate an energy source that will not be emitting CO2 in the atmosphere. How do we do that? With a process that actually uses the carbon that is contained in the feedstock as the energy source to extract that hydrogen. We do that in small localized systems like the one you can see on this photo that can typically process about 20 to 30 tons per day of waste. That produces about 1.5 tons of hydrogen, which is the equivalent of what a filling station today, what a gasoline stand is producing and is serving about 200 to 300 cars per day. And what's important here is there is carbon involved in this pathway, and this carbon through our system, when connected to carbon capture and sequestration solutions, can literally make this whole pathway a carbon sink, a carbon negative pathway that will, unlike green hydrogen, the hydrogen being produced out of electrolysis powered by renewable electricity, this pathway here can literally take carbon out of the atmosphere and send it back underground where it belongs. This technology we're developing has about 20 years history. Today, we are reaching the 4th generation and solutions are available now. We are entering commercial phase. We are in discussion with 3 different potential users, and we expect to have those systems contracted by the end of the year. Applications are, of course, this carbon negative hydrogen fuel being used, but where there is no use for hydrogen, this hydrogen can be used as a power source, for example, for off-grid communities, as well as to process waste that potentially can be hazardous and that needs to be processed locally. And finally, there is something also that is extremely important to realize is that we are talking a lot about recycling, but very few of the plastics and papers that are considered being recycled are actually recyclable. What we offer here is a solution to literally and truly recycle those paper, plastics and other sources into a very useful and non-carbonized feedstock. Thank you very much.
C'est bon, Fabrice.
Yes, we are back now for this last session of the Climate Tech Awards. And before going ahead in this field, we are going to, in fact, at the Climate Tech Awards, design who will be the two nominees, who will be the two startups on the early stage level to support by accelerating them, by also going by funding acceleration and market acceleration and technology acceleration if they need. Now I'm going to jump in another session to prepare it, but just to introduce a little bit before, we are going to have a very small break of 5 minutes before going ahead. I'm going to present the session who is going to run in at 4 p.m. Paris Central Paris time zone, and to welcome for this very specific session dedicated to the massive and green recovery is expected everywhere. Citizen lifestyle with a greener lifestyle is expected everywhere. If we would like to all of us mitigate the temperature up to 1.5 to 2 degrees, so we have to fulfill new companies, new products, new goods, new services aligned with this target. That it means probably we have to drive forces to reinvent a sort of capital allocation to low carbon contribution, and also to raise up in the same time the companies who is going to support this strategy for a net zero target. So let's have a break, a coffee break or a tea break as you prefer, and let's back in 5 minutes for this. Keep tuned. Yes. Hi everyone, we are back for this last but not least session, the session 2.5, about how to reboot a new lifestyle, less carbon intensive, and how can we also, in the same time, to make it happen, drive the funding allocation in the right direction. That it comes also to talk on carbon offsetting or carbon offsettings. We could have another look on it. And for introducing the purpose, I would like to address with my distinguished panelists and to present them very shortly. To welcome Dr. Pradeep Monga, former Deputy Executive Secretary to combat the desertification at UNCCD and former Director of Energy and Climate Change at UNIDO. Also, Hongming Liu, who is the Senior Manager of China Climate and Environment Defense Fund, the EDF, and will drive after this a very smart session, a fire chat session with Tommy Ricketts, CEO and co-founder of B0Carbon, and Werner Wiesseyen, Department of Engineering of the University of Cambridge, to redesign, not to, how can we say, rebuild the world, but rebuild our lifestyle. And according to our practice, how can we make line moves from the daily carbon offsetting mechanism to another direction? So before introducing the purpose with this specific fire chat, I would like to share the purpose with Dr. Pradeep Monga, the former Secretary of United Nations.
Thank you very much for having me in this very important session that focuses on climate techs, lifestyles, carbon offsetting, with a key focus also on Africa as a region. Let me refer to the opening session, which focused on three key themes, namely everything, everyone is connected everywhere. A crossing approach is needed, and of course, we need a new sustainable deal, and that sums up very well the essence and direction of this very important conference. In my view, there was clear consensus and clarion call in the morning session as well as other sessions to break the silos and start addressing climate change, biodiversity loss, and land degradation collectively and in an integrated way. When we talk about the decarbonization of our economies, we're talking about clean energy systems, which are transformatives, and the way we produce, use, and price our energy. We must also talk about ecosystem services provided by sustainable land management, ecosystem conservation, and landscape restoration approaches. In my view, there are two sides of the same coin. Let me pick up two specific examples, building on earlier sessions and my intervention. The first example is a recent report on net zero by 2050 released by the International Energy Agency. This report, which was also released among other forums at Dublin Climate Dialogues, highlights the fact that climate pledges made by governments to date, even if fully achieved, would fall well short of what is required to bring greenhouse gas emissions fast enough worldwide to achieve less than 1.5 degree by 2050. To achieve net zero by 2050, we would need to move to clean and resilient energy and ecosystems dominated by renewables, especially solar and wind. And this would mean adopting a very ambitious and transformative global clean energy agenda that envisages no investments in new fossil fuel supply projects and no further investments in new coal plants. That will require a fundamental shift in many parts of the world, especially in developing countries. Imagine our world where no sales of new internal combustion engine passenger cars take place by 2035, or by 2040, global electricity sector becomes almost net zero emission sector. This will make huge progress towards achieving net zero by 2050. When we talk about transformative energy systems pathways, it is also important to look at the option of providing access to modern energy to over 250 million over 800 million people who have no access to energy and providing clean cooking solutions to 2.6 billion people, especially women and girl child who are most affected due to lack of access to modern clean energy cook fuels. And especially these communities live in poorest regions, including sub-Saharan Africa. The second example I would like to talk about is Great Green Wall Initiative, which is taking place in the sub-Saharan region of Africa. The Great Green Wall Initiative is regreening the Sahel, restoring degraded lands, and providing decent livelihoods for its people, covering the Sahel all the way from Senegal in the west to Djibouti in the east, restoring degraded lands, fixing carbon, and at the same time providing jobs and opportunities for millions of people to have a decent life in Africa. The main objective of Great Green Wall initiatives was originally to create a long green vegetation cover of at least 7,000 kilometers long and 50 kilometers wide, all along in the Sahel region, covering almost 11 countries. In recent years, this vision has evolved into an integrated ecosystem management approach, striving for a mosaic of different land use and production systems, especially including value chains, focusing on sustainable dryland management and restoration, regeneration of natural vegetation, as well as water retention and conservation measures, including regenerative agriculture. By 2030, the Great Green Wall Initiative aims to restore almost 100 million hectares of currently degraded land, sequester almost 250 million tons of carbon, and create 10 million jobs in rural areas. This is a very good example of where a transformative ecosystem program can contribute to climate, land, and biodiversity agenda, along with creating jobs. Great Green Wall is in sense covering almost 15 out of 17 sustainable development goals in that region. It is one of the largest transformative projects that addresses climate change, biodiversity, and land degradation at the same time. And this is what we require. Let me conclude by emphasizing the fact that we need more of such transformative projects and programs like Great Green Wall around the world. Africa has shown the green pathway that could transform and decarbonize economies, have ecosystem restoration, address climate change, both on mitigation and adaptation side, and simultaneously create green jobs, promote green energy, and enhance landscape restoration. And that's the way to go. Thank you so much for having me in this very important session.
Yes, thanks Dr. Pradeep Manga for sharing and setting the scene of this issue where all, again, is connected. And I would like now to share the point of view of Hongming Liu, the Senior Manager of China Climate and Environment Defense Fund, the EDF, and after going and jumping on the fire chat session.
Hi everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to wherever you are. First of all, thanks to the CPC for inviting me to this event and for letting me to share these practices and outlook on China's voluntary GHG emission reduction activities. I'm Liu Hongming, the Senior Manager of Global Climate Initiative at Environmental Defense Fund, Beijing Representative Office. Climate change is the greatest market failure that the world has ever seen. We believe the market-based solutions will be one of the best approaches for addressing climate change globally. As you may know, China recently updated its climate pledge. China will achieve its carbon peaking before 2030, and it will achieve its carbon neutrality before 2060. Now a lot of people around the world are seeing what China will take for achieving its carbon and climate commitments. So I will share with you from the voluntary emission reduction perspective the status of China voluntary GHG emission reduction program, which is well known as the CCR program. Here are some facts. The CCR program was officially launched its registry in 2015. In 2017, the CCR program suspended the application for its new methodologies, projects, emission reductions insurance, verification bodies, and exchanges for its reform. However, the transactions, deliveries, and the retirements of the existing CCERs that were issued prior to March 14, 2017 was not affected. At present, a total of 9 exchanges, 12 verification bodies, and 200 emission reduction methodologies are existing in the system. Almost 3,000 CCR projects have been validated. More than 1,000 CCR projects have been registered, and 287 CCR projects have had their emission reductions approved for insurance. The 1,047 registered CCR projects are expected to reduce emissions by almost 140 million tons CO2 equivalent annually. Here are the diagrams that comprehensive showing registered project types of the CCR program. We can see the most registered number of projects belonging to the wind power projects, which brings to more than 50 million tons of CO2 emission reductions annually. Here are the 287 CCR projects that approved for insurance categorized by project types. Wind power projects also stay at the top of the number of projects that approved for insurance and also for the amount of approved emission reductions for insurance. We can also see in the diagram that the registered and approved for insurance project types, LULUCF is really small amount here, including the forestry projects, which means we have a lot of potentials in the future for the biodiversity-related voluntary emission reduction projects that can be registered under the CCR program. Definitely, it will depend on the future CCR program reform and the future requirements of the CCR program. Here are the uses of the China voluntary GHG emission reductions. Each of the China's local carbon market have introduced the offset mechanisms, which are encourage the usage of the CCRs. As well as the China's national TS, it also planning to use China CCRs in the future. CCRs also adopted by the guidelines for carbon neutrality of large-scale events and as a recommended voluntary emission reduction credits. And also CCR adopted by CORSIA as one of the eligible emission units for addressing international aviation emissions. Other than the national level voluntary GHG emission reduction activities, we have a lot of other voluntary GHG emission reduction activities in China at the provincial and city level. In Beijing has designed 2 local voluntary GHG emission reduction programs, specifically an energy saving programs and a forestry carbon sequestration program. In Guangdong, it has introduced the Puhui Certified Emission Reduction Program. In Fujian, it has introduced a provincial forestry carbon sequestration program. All of these voluntary GHG emission reduction programs are the complementary programs to their local carbon markets. And it incentivized the voluntary emission reduction projects at their local level. After introducing the national and local level voluntary GHG emission reduction activities in China, I would also like to share some outlook for future voluntary GHG emission reduction activities. Back to 2019, EDF did an analysis on how carbon markets can increase climate ambition. In the analysis, global emissions trading could reduce the total mitigation cost of meeting current Paris pledge by 59% to 79%. This translates to about $300 billion to $400 billion in current value terms over 2020 to 2035. If we utilize the global emission trading revenues reinvested into the greater emission reductions, in the analysis, it shows that the cumulative emission reductions over the period of 2020 to 2035 would nearly double the emission reductions that would be achieved using only current policies. So, by this analysis, we actually look forward to more ambitious future voluntary emission reduction activities. We need the China restarts its voluntary GHG emission reduction programs with a robust criteria that ensure the high-quality credits generation. And for the international cooperation, it should follow the guidance such as Article 6 to avoid double counting, double insurance, and double claiming of the voluntary emission reduction. And for the use of voluntary emission reductions towards the carbon neutrality goal should also be carefully defined in the future. This is all of what I'm sharing. Thanks for listening.
Yes, we are back now. Thanks a lot, Hongming Liu from EDF, the task force to drive a new scheme in China mainland. And I would like now to start this fire chat panel, an exclusive fire chat dedicated to a new lifestyle because a new carbon offsetting mechanism. I would like, first of all, to also share the science-based evidence and the science approach. Probably both of you, Tommy and Werner, so we'll welcome also Werner, who's going to be part of this fire chat, have heard about the Oxford principle to drive forces and to switch the capital in the, we used to say, the right direction. Supposed to say that the right direction is to be net zero. We hope so. And from this new background, new perspective, what are for you the limits of the daily mechanism of the carbon offsetting, and why we should probably try to find different ways when it comes to offset the carbon and to be also innovative in this field? How can we push the limits to innovate in this field and to, at the end of the day, to be carbon neutral?
Great questions, and thanks again for having me. And good to hear from the colleagues on the last two calls. So I think carbon offsets have a role to play in the transition to a low carbon economy. If you look at the IPCC data, roughly about a third or 30% of the transition towards the Paris alignment is going to come from increasing the carry capacity of the planet. So, if decarbonisation or net zero is 2/3, then active, carrying capacity is the third. And I think a lot of that will come from nature-based solutions, and then obviously the role of technology in direct air capture or chemical solutions in terms of other types of avoidance or removal credits. On the latest projections, the voluntary offset market has actually gone up 50 times in the past in terms of volumes in the past 10 years. That's 2010 to 2020, and the value is now roughly 2 to 3 billion, in terms of transacted credits. That's set to rise to about 100 billion by the end of this decade. So it gives you a sense of not just the fact that legislators or international bodies recognize it as being a role and having a contributing capacity, but also that markets are starting to wake up to it. And they're going to see a huge explosion in demand. And if anything, supply is really a constraining factor here right now. It's not demand. But there are a lot of structural concerns our company has, and I can tell you a little bit about the products that we're delivering later. But there's really a way to boil that down is around this idea of returning carbon credits or offset markets back to the primacy of carbon. Because actually, in a credit, the standards associated with it, the certifications, are typically the end of the conversation about quality. You go through you do your PDDs and you go through a certification regime, the gold standard, VCS, etc. It's stamped, and then it's a ton. Now, I used to be a financial analyst at an investment bank, looking at sort of global macro and how markets and interacted with each other. And really, what is price? Price is the distribution of risk. So if you're pricing a credit and you're modeling something, discounting it back to today in terms of its volumes, but then you're having a static assumption of those volumes, that doesn't really add up. It's not a very sophisticated instrument, so you need to have this idea around quality revived and the idea around price discovery put in that. Now, to do that, you need to return it, we think, as a business, and I think this is emerging, to this idea of a rating system to understand post-certification quality. In fact, we're one of only, I'm pretty sure the only company in the world that has a rating system on a global exchange right now. And that will be coming very, very soon. So one, I would say they are great, and the market's growing. They're not great, they can be great, but the market's growing. But the really simple number to remember is you can buy an offset for 10 cents or $1,000, and they all say that they're a ton. They can't all be a ton. It doesn't quite work. They can't all be equal to the same output. And then finally, just in terms of the market dynamics, I would just say that the really big trend of the past 10, 15 years has been OTC trading, over-the-counter trading. You have to call up at a project sponsor or an aggregator and say, have you got any projects and what do they cost? That's a bad thing, we think, because it encourages opaque markets, inefficiencies, and asymmetries of power. I think the next 10 years are going to be all around the transition to exchanges and exchange-based and transparent trading. So I think, just to conclude, quality and transparency are the object of the challenges of the next 10 years, but the market is certainly growing and offsets have a role to play.
Thanks, Tommy. It's very interesting that you send me the direct connection to Werner. So Werner, welcome to you on this Fire Chat panel. Are you there, Werner?
Thanks very much, Fabrice. It's great to be here.
Yes, great. I'm going to ask you first just to present you in very short 30 seconds to 1 minute to who you are, and answering this directly connection with Tommy. Tommy, highlight us the importance not only about the volume but the quality when we talk about offsetting. The question will be, in fact, do you think now we have to embed, because we deal also with climate techs in this issue, now to be better, how can we say, transparent, better fair, and all the value chain on the accountancy, to embed like blockchain technology, for example, let's talk like this, and climate techs bridging blockchain technologies could drive an open mind and open transparency for everyone. to be in fact to strengthen the market first, and also to scale the market, doing the both of the engine, to strengthen and to scale.
Okay, thanks, Fabrice.
Yes, let's introduce you.
Just to briefly introduce myself, I'm Werner Risainen. I'm currently a PhD student in engineering at the University of Cambridge. I'm helping to decarbonize the transport sector to scaling up of lightweight composite materials. And beyond my research, I'm very interested in exploring the societal pathways for how we transition towards a more sustainable, low carbon society while avoiding the worst effects of the climate crisis. So the topic of the panel is on carbon offsets and how do we scale these up and what role do they have to play in the kind of transition towards net zero. And I have kind of three main points to make, and they'll in some ways respond to what Pradeep and Tommy had said earlier, that they have a lot of potential, but there's also a lot of downfalls in the current makeup of carbon offsets and how they're currently used, which can lead us down a dangerous path, and we need to avoid that at all costs. And I also wanted to highlight the importance of nature-based carbon offsetting solutions as a way forward to build on those co-benefits that Pradeep Manga raised previously through his Great Green Wall project. So the kind of key issue that I have with carbon offsetting in its present moment is that it's basically used by polluting companies to improve their public image, and thus they, in their current form, represent nothing more than a greenwashing tactic. And this is evident from the excellent report from the University of Oxford called the Oxford Offsetting Principles that set out to create a feasible framework for fixing the offsetting system and making offsetting actually a meaningful thing. And the other thing that the report makes clear is that the principal focus for climate action should be on reducing carbon emissions, focusing on reducing carbon emissions in the first place, thus minimizing the need for accounting for excess emissions in the first place. So, however, often this critical point is not applied in practice when using carbon offsets. As an example, airlines are often declaring that they want to become net zero using solely offsets, but they're not actually reducing their emissions from the operations. And so this is just a kind of marketing campaign to boost their image while not actually doing anything towards transitioning towards net zero. And also because often the offsets that they're using that they're buying are not good quality offsets, as was raised by our previous panelists, that they need to be of a good standard. But in any case, what we're seeing is that companies are using offsets as a greenwashing tool, and this won't lead us anywhere on the road to net zero. And we need an overhaul of the system if it's gonna work in any feasible manner. And I think what Tommy is doing kind of working towards that aim. But in the first instance, we need to keep fossil fuels in the ground, and we need to hold current companies whose operations are based on fossil fuel extraction to account, and not allow them to use carbon offsets to justify operating as normal, because we need a new normal. We cannot continue as we have been for the last 50 to hundreds of years. And the second point I wanted to make is that kind of reiterate the point that we need to be focusing on achieving absolute zero emissions. Tommy made the point that the IPCC sort of pathways highlight that we need to be removing carbon as well. But I don't think we can be relying on removing carbon in the long term. What we should be focusing on is doing what's feasibly possible now, which is deploying renewable energy strategies and electrifying the industries where that we can using currently available technology, rather than continuing on the current pathways and then hoping that some miracle carbon removal technologies can be scaled up in 10, 20 years time, which by then it might already be too late. So kind of related to this, a Cambridge academic in my department in Cambridge produced a report called Absolute Zero a few years back. And the main thesis of this report is that we cannot wait for these technologies to be developed within the short time frame. And instead, we need to focus on existing technology to electrify industries that can be electrified while shrinking the industries that cannot be, for example, aviation and shipping. And this sort of approach, which was developed for the UK, can be extended globally. And I think the key focus should be on deploying existing technologies, and this is where climate tech companies have a huge role to play. But finally, I wanted to raise the point, which builds on what Pradeep said earlier, is that we need to integrate, an holistic approach to addressing the climate crisis that goes beyond simply carbon reductions. So while I'm saying we should not focus too heavily on carbon offsetting, one area where there's huge potential is with nature-based carbon offsetting solutions, because they have a huge number of other co-benefits which can improve local resilience to climate and enhance the quality of life for local communities and also build biodiversity. So as a personal example, but slightly smaller in scale to the Great Green Wall described by Pradeep Manga, I was involved in a reforestation project in southern India called Sadhana Forest. And this project started in 2003 with a barren patch of land, but now is a flourishing forest with a large community living there. So as a result of this reforestation work that they did over a short span of time, the soil was replenished, water collection was made possible again, trees provided shade, and the fruit trees could also provide nutrition. And this allowed humans to return to the area while also benefiting quality of life in many ways. Mm-hmm. So it shows that while also removing carbon from the atmosphere, you can reverse the effects of deforestation, desertification, and solutions are hugely beneficial to build resilience. And I think this is where the real benefits of carbon offsetting can be seen. And I think these are the sort of carbon offsetting projects we should be working towards, these sort of transformative projects, as Pradeep so well put it. And I think this is where sort of climate tech companies can have a huge impact, potentially employing, as you said, Fabrice, sort of blockchain technologies to make these connections easier and develop these projects on a global scale. I think
yes,
just I think that's a good summary for now, but we can move on.
Yes, it's a great transition, Werner, also to Tommy, because it's all to put together the public and private sector and the organization, the greater ones, and the smarter ones, like the startup scene. And I would like to address the same purpose to Tommy. We can have a huge impact by the mainstream of the United Nations processes, and we could have a smart and sometimes a huge impact with your embedded innovative solution in the powered by startup. Tommy, how can you, as you are the CEO and the co-founder of B0 Carbon, what do you think the startup scene could provide to us, not only to drive solution for a market, but to have an impact of this issue? From the startup point of view, Tommy.
So I think it's really interesting to hear what you're saying, Werner, first of all. Shame we can't be in a room together. It would be very good to have a discussion. I think I agree with some of what you're saying, but I certainly, all of the sentiment, but maybe not all the detail. To the role of startups, look, I think it's very interesting what's going on in the startup community right now around climate change, because typically speaking, the adaptation towards the climate economy that's coming through in businesses is constrained by their own borders of what they actually do. Because climate change is really a combination of engineering skills, earth scientists, and economics, with a lot of persuasion and psychology probably involved. I think very few businesses really have that skill set inside of them. University might have some of them, bank might have others, PwC, etc. might have some other ones, management consultancies. And so what's really happening, and certainly this is an explicit hiring strategy of our company and many others, is bringing skills together from engineering, from finance, from academia, from the scientific community, and actually allowing them all to sit in the same room. And that's just even on that sort of simple recruiting agenda, the flexibility to look left and right, not up and down, as in lateral, not longitudinal, is what the climate economy really needs. And that's why big innovation right now is not coming from the large companies. It's really not. In fact, I'm sure most companies that have been growing in this space who've got a half decent product have been, someone's tried to buy them already, even within, you know, it's happened to us already. So I think big companies are struggling to deal with it because they're constrained by the things that made them successful. And adapting to climate change is not the thing that made them successful typically. So, you know, that's a kind of big existential issue actually, and startups are unconstrained. Now, in terms of what they're really doing, I think trying to, and this is sort of my pitch to, we have 7 or 8 academics we've taken out of universities. And I can start to give you my sense of what a pitch is to them, bearing in mind my colleague and I were professional researchers as well. It's about joining the trenches and joining the front line of making this change and understanding that climate awareness, the transition of the idea of we need to care about this, has been won, but climate action is only starting. And so to really implement climate action, you need to, make some compromises about what you think the world's doing, and also have some real kind of sight of working with a whole bunch of companies or a whole bunch of NGOs or a whole, you know, non-government institutions or, you know, whoever it might be, influence groups, understand their priorities, put yourselves in their shoes, and then try to create economic solutions to the environmental change. Because ultimately, the battle is lost when people think adapting to climate change, environmental externalities in general, is an antagonistic activity. The moment you tell someone, stop, negative, you're blowing the world up, you're making everything difficult, you just get people's backups. And you don't need to have worked in politics to know that messaging is very important, and positive messaging is really all of the game here. So the idea here is you need to show and demonstrate to people that prosperity, both in lifestyle, which is the original kind of title of this talk, in personal decision making, and in, you know, feelings, you know, like you're making contribution to the global community, you know, that's a positive activity actually. And so again, to that point of what can startups do, they can listen to the challenges being faced by the larger organizations, and in so doing, develop their own economy, which is satisfying many of those needs, and demonstrating to all the companies that will listen that taking a much more positive and progressive approach now will make them more resilient in the future. And, you know, if you really want to, certainly what, you know, left caused me to leave global markets and do this, there's this very old maxim, which is the Friedman essay on what is shareholder value. You know, so what is the purpose of a business? Is to maximize shareholder value. Actually, for the first time, you can make a very good argument that environmental investments and environmental adaptation is maximizing shareholder value. So you can actually align those two outcomes. And so again, that's about potentially, for many people, me included, compromising on some of the original things that I thought of when I was coming through the ranks. And, you know, I'm the son of 2 left-wing academics, so it's not something that they're very happy with me saying 20 years ago. But also recognizing that you need to compromise, and that actually a positive vision can be done outside of large institutions, because you're not constrained by the rules that they set for themselves and the functionality that you have to sit and satisfy with it. And actually, I'd extend that to universities as well as corporates and governments. So, you know, the private sector has a very crucial role to play in this, because corporates are global, governments are nations, you know, bound by their national boundaries. So that's how I would bring it together.
Yes, and just to follow up with this, and to make also the reverse connection with Werner, we notice, Tommy, that in fact it's the way and the angle you take the same goals that we are all agree about the Paris Agreement. Sometimes not all agree on the way to implement it, but let's say about the mindset to drive the processes to make it happen. You mentioned the multinationals, the big corporations, and you are a representative of the startup scene. Do you think beyond our daily job, no matter if you are a startup or a VC or a climate tech or a fintech, in fact we are designing the solution not only for sustainability, we are designing solution for generation and the generation ahead. So that it means a lifestyle. A new lifestyle comes with this, a new mindset from the core how can we say, DNA of each companies, and this mindset we have in common, because we have a common goal. In fact, we are going to live in this world. We don't know what kind of world we will live in. We try to do our best by our own activity and to have an impact, indeed, to try to have an impact on it. Do you think now there is a new culture, a new mindset, and start from the science-based evidence to the consciousness, and then to aligning with a business-friendly, business compliance to be profitable and also impactful? Because if you want to be impactful, sometimes you're not profitable as the first time, but you have also to, with this mindset and with this DNA, to convince the people who have the finance, the investment capability to follow you in this direction. What do you think? Yes,
to Werner or to me?
Yes, Tommy. According to the mindset, the DNA, we have to you have to also mention about the communication, which is very important. But
yeah, I think so. Look, I think I understand the question. So it's not necessarily, you know, the idea of reprogramming society is the sort of is the great hope, isn't it? When you're learning about everything, you're trying to think about these things, and obviously it's what you ultimately want to achieve. But one's idea of reprogramming might not be anyone else's. So, you know, that's why you have democratic institutions. But I think that, you know, what are the kind of key questions we ask ourselves, and how do they fit into this vision? The key questions of ourselves are: can we have safe and healthy lives? You know, 1, 2, are we going to have opportunities in the future? You know, is there going to be the ability to generate prosperity and affluence at the same level as prior generations? Or rather, there should be, and therefore, how are we going to do that? And ultimately, all of those questions that we ask ourselves have always been in this sort of this idea of looking forward, but unconstrained by resources. You know, basically, it's an unconstrained world. You know, and economics is the study of scarcity, so it's ironic, but the prevailing economic thesis is an unconstrained world. And what's happened, and why have we spent 200 years? You know, population growth has gone up 7 times. It took 200,000 years to grow to 1 billion, and it took 150 years to go to 7 billion. There's something very funny is going on there. Likewise, wealth has grown immeasurably in that period, even if it's not distributed equally. It has in absolute terms, even in many relative terms. Well, there's been this thing which was dug up and burnt, which is basically millions of years of concentrated power, which is called fossil fuels. And so actually in the history of our time, as you know, on this planet, we've really been constrained most of the time. And so society has been a combination of those questions with the knowledge that we are constrained by the environment we live in. And so the biggest mindset shift will be not necessarily reprogramming, but reminding everyone that as recently as 250 years ago, the biggest question in every philosopher, every economist, every politician's mind was, you know, the fact that there was 1 billion people on this planet. We had no idea how to deal with that. And that's what's I think that's what's kind of starting to happen, really, if you think about all the people which I've seen today speaking and all the institutions that are involved. And on the ground, it's about proving, I think, that those questions, how do I be healthier? How do I be more successful? How do I have the opportunities that I want? Can exist within this question of we live on the planet and the planet satisfies our questions. It's not the other way around. And so, you know, in very simple ecological economics terms, it's the idea that, you know, the economy exists within an ecology, not the other way around. And so I think that's the kind of mission here, and that's the kind of communications that I would go by.
I absolutely agree with Tommy that there needs to be a sort of shift in the economics if we're going to address the climate crisis, and we need to be rethinking the way that the economy works fundamentally. And he introduced the idea of ecological limits as being sort of a new idea that we're facing up against, that current economics does not know how to deal with, because it basically aims for continued economic growth at continued exponential growth. And this means continued resource extraction, and currently also means exponential increase, like continued increases in CO2 emissions. So some of your paradigms that I'm sort of interested in are the idea of donut economics that was developed by Kate Raworth at Oxford, that kind of sets a new framework from which we can think about the economy. So we can think about so typically economics thinks economy in terms of the simple metric, the GDP, within national, international scales, but actually the donut economics framework sets it out in terms of well-being metrics at the center of the donut, and then the environmental limits at the outside of the donut. And the idea is that you need to stay within that donut. You need to achieve those well-being targets while keeping within those environmental limits. And it's about a complete reframing. And if we can extend this framework to businesses and to wider society, I think there's huge scope for us to rapidly transform the way we're operating. And I think the current paradigm of GDP growth is inadequate. And if you're solely relying on seeking profits at all costs and then expecting that the environmental benefits will come by seeking that profit, we're not going to reach where we need to be in the time that we have available. And the other point I wanted to make, that in terms of lifestyle change, one of the key things that we can all do is to address our economy's fundamental relationship with consumerism and consumption, where we have all the resources and the wealth that we need. As Tommy said, wealth has been continually increasing, absolutely and relatively speaking, but it's just so inadequately distributed that some people have way more than they need and some people have way less than they need. So it's not so, and we don't actually, there's this idea that we need to be constantly growing and consuming more to have better quality of life and better prosperity. But there's new research coming out, for example, from the University of Leeds, showing that we can meet the requirements of the Paris Agreement in terms of our CO2 emissions while having equivalent or better prospects in terms of quality of life. It's just about reducing our consumption. And this, you can do that on an individual level to some extent, but this needs a societal transformation in the way that we're looking at consumption, in our mindsets about consumption and what we are actually, what's the purpose of the economy and what we should be aiming towards. And kind of combining those two, the donor economics and deconsumption and degrowth, I think those are some of the key ways that I think we can look at this. And startups, by having a new, fresh look at things, they can sort of push in that direction.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thanks, Werner. I would like now to have an open question to you both. I'm going to bridge 2 points that you have highlighted. First, Tommy, you have highlighted also the growing population from 15 years ago to now probably 7 billion and much more in the next decade. So that it means produce more. And for you, because the demand is huge, and starting from the energy, but the goods and products also. From your also perspective that you are highlight, Werner, is to try to reduce our consumption. So when we just bring these two pieces, there is a clear contradiction. It's mathematical. If we would like to address and to connect, to make these two pieces compliant, we have to be very innovative. If we don't have to be very innovative, it will be, or it could be painful. We know it quite already. So what could be the innovation, startup driven, or the science, or engineering could provide us, in fact, to do both, sometimes to consume less, and the other time to probably to produce more with less. What could be your input on this field, on this crossing field? Tommy.
I'll give you a top-down and a bottom-up answer. Top-down, exactly, but from different perspectives. if you really want to affect change, you need to address the fundamental problem with the environment, which is it's not priced. Society has no way to understand it because it doesn't price it. And in fact, it's a Cambridge economist called Arthur Cecil Pigou, who's I'm a particular fan of, who invented the idea of welfare economics and the idea of externalities. And the environment is the mother of all externalities, or the tragedy of the commons, however you want to talk about it. So if you want to really deal with this issue in probably quite a nasty way, certainly for this generation that exists right now, you would reframe this idea of organic versus inorganic food. Just as a simple example, organic food is normally 50–70% more expensive than inorganic food. Why? Because it's environmentally friendly. There's so much wrong with that statement. Inorganic food should be more expensive than organic food because it's not environmentally friendly. And that's going to cause huge problems, which is the kind of ghost, the ghost in the room for the environmental agenda, which is social welfare. Basically, if you go in and you reprice the environment properly, people who are already poor, who are already suffering, who are already struggling to get access to the things that they need, are going to be, or at least perceptibly, going to be priced out of the services. Because part of that, that cyclical consumer cycle, which is itself not that old actually, is this idea that they should be consuming, that everyone deserves the right to an iPhone, everyone deserves the right to a washing machine, everyone deserves the right to a house, whatever it might be. And they should deserve that, fair enough. But also, should they? So that's the top-down view. Bottom up, I think, well, that's rather the paradox, should I say. Bottom up, I think the really interesting thing about demographics is you're really talking about, where are countries aging? Exception of China, because it's already got a huge base. It's basically Western democracies, US, Western Europe and Japan. They've all got declining, if not flat populations. Areas of high population growth, the poorest economies, with some, very, very, small exceptions. So if you think about it in demographic terms, it's very difficult not to slip into some very nasty political spaces very quickly. Really, you should think about it in wealth transfer terms, because actually, a lot of those, what's really driving this is urbanization, and what's really driving urbanization and falling living standards in many of those countries is because it's the lack of an economy in the regional or the rural areas, because land is not priced properly. So the bottom-up way of saying this, and this links back to the offset argument, I do think this is the bigger agenda for COP27 actually, is there should be an enormous wealth transfer going on from crowded developed countries to more sparsely populated, richer, environmental countries. And that would be a very, very interesting way of starting to arrest this, because demographics always start to come down when living standards improve, because birth rates go up as death rates go down. Every single country that's experienced this has the same profile. It's not unique to any country. It's just a function of humanity. So if you can create a wealth transfer to those rural communities, which are the sources of the highest population growth in the poorest countries, predicated in some instances on those offset incomes, it's going to go a long way towards squaring that whole circle, I think.
Interesting. For your perspective, Werner, I'm going to be back with one point after Tommy on this ending sentence. Werner, what could be your input on this field to be innovative according to the mismatch of these two exigencies? How can we make them compliant and to be innovative, creative? The limit is on the earth. The unlimited is the creativity to make it happen. What could be your angle or your input in this?
So my angle on this is that we need to, the population question is poorly framed, that we often see the climate or the increasing population as causing climate crisis, but it's actually the increase in consumption. And that consumption is mainly led by a very small percentage of our global population, the wealthiest amongst the globe. And according to Oxfam report, about 10% of the globe's population accounts for 50% of the emissions. And this is largely because they consume way more and way in much greater amounts than the rest of the world. But they also consume way more than they actually need. But there's no limits on excess consumptions by the wealthy and by the rich, who can continually, and I can count me amongst, like, there's no higher end limits on consumption. And that's the reason why facing this crisis. It's not because there are more children being born in less developed countries who basically contribute nothing to global emissions at the moment. And there's an argument that developing countries need to reach a higher level of development. And yes, this is a moral argument that they need better well-being targets to meet that similar quality of life. But there's no way that we can afford to have all of us living at the same levels of consumption and CO2 emissions that we currently have in Western Europe or the Americas. Our world would just collapse immediately. We need to be reducing our consumption in the Western countries while bringing up developing countries to a halfway level in between that allows us to all reaches an equilibrium in terms of our quality of life while also staying within the environmental limits. So I think focusing too much on the sort of population rise as the cause of climate change is the wrong approach, and it's essentially blaming the climate crisis on the people that have almost no responsibility for causing it, historically speaking. And the focus on bringing down emissions, going and transitioning, it needs to start with the West, who historically started, for example, the UK, where started the Industrial Revolution 200 years ago, and communally speaking, have contributed way more to the carbon emissions in the atmosphere than almost any other country. And so this is where we need to be starting this question. I think moving away from the paradigm of population growth as being the problem here.
Mm-hmm. And for this, I'm going to share with you the last but not least question to conclude this very insightful panel with, how can we say, a new generation of entrepreneurs or researchers. You mentioned about the transfer of many things, the equilibrium between many things. When it comes with carbon emission, so the carbon is transferring in the atmosphere everywhere. When it comes to mitigation, the economy, stability, it comes also with innovation, technologies, and help different countries to meet the net zero target. Do you think both, and I will ask you and Werner and then Tommy, that we have also to make a transfer also on the tech side? Technology transfer on this geographic zone to help them and support to implement a new model, sustainable model.
Yes, absolutely. I think there's a case to be made for sort of climate reparations because of that cumulative responsibility of the West for the climate crisis. There needs, if we are thinking about this from a kind of climate justice lens, we need to have a wealth transfer and a tech transfer of technologies from the West to allow developing countries to reach that level of well-being that we are already used to, but in a way that is much lower carbon emitting. So we cannot be, but part of the problem is that what's happening now is that Western multinationals, for example, the oil majors, are going into developing countries and forcing onto them a oil-based economy as a way of expanding their markets and expanding their reach and maximizing their profits. And what we actually need is we need for developing countries to bypass that fossil fuel phase, and renewable energy is becoming cheaper and cheaper. And what needs to happen is that tech transfer from Western nations needs to be handed over and paid for to developing nations who have suffered at the expense of Western countries, who have been constantly extracting resources from them in order to benefit them. So if we are to be addressing this from that perspective, that transfer needs to happen, and the West needs to be paying for the developing nations to develop into a net zero economy while also bypassing the need for fossil fuels in between.
Thanks, Werner. And now just back to Tommy. What will be your input as a representative of the startup scene?
I think it's a very good question. The idea of technology and money go hand in hand, I think. I think you actually hit the nail on the head when you said carbon is global. It's very interesting to dwell on that point, because carbon is global. So actually, once you start to see some of these technological innovations starting to take off in the more developed countries, they're not going to just turn them off if they start hitting their targets. And one thing that is super interesting is that, back to our last panel, biodiversity is local, socioeconomics is local, carbon is global. So I think in many ways, there doesn't need to be a physical transfer of technology for some of these industries anyway, in the same way as there would have been in different types of industrial complexes, because a lot of these things will be targeting the same source, basically. So I think but for the economic transition, I think the more that companies can start up in any place and start to generate wealth and value creation from climate transition and in the future climate economy, you'll start to rebalance a lot of these issues. So the more that can be done to encourage that, the better. And ultimately, justice and economic prosperity, which is not very good and not very aligned with typical capitalist modes of industrial productivity, that has to be front and center of how we do this in the next 20 or 30 years.
Thanks a lot, Tommy. Thanks a lot, Werner, for your deep insight, your practical insight to co-design this panel. I do also, by my side, appreciate our discussion, everything we have shared with it, and also hopefully with the audiences, broad audiences. So I would like to thank Dr. Pradeep Monga, Hongming Liu for their message intervention. Yes, indeed, Tommy Ricketts, and Werner Visayan from UK also. So very pleased to have you, and we are going to turn to another, but not least, series, which is the series number 3, to create the new leadership. And I think that we have set the basis of this series. So let's back in a few minutes now. See you then. Bye-bye. Here we go. We are back in the series 3, the last but not least. For this series 3, it's all about building the new leadership with 3 targets. We are going to highlight the pitch voice of citizen, no matter if you are a scientist, scientific, if you are a young generation, or if you sit in a COMEX or a board member. And for this, we're going to start with, indeed, Eliane Rouillet-Chevalier. She is the corporate board member and non-executive director of many companies, big companies. She is also a member of the French Administrators Association and Responsible Capitalism Institute. So, yes, please, Eliane Rouillet-Chevalier, we're going to hear your message. Dedicated to...
Well, thank you to give me the opportunity to take the floor as a board member of French-based companies and as a corporate citizen voice. I'd like to share with you this afternoon the way we can move on from emotion to action regarding a cleaner future. In the huge challenge we must face, the role of corporate is crucial. Of course, alongside policymakers, regulators, the educational sector, the media, and other participants in civil society. But if we want, like Jean Jouzel is calling for, to reach carbon neutrality by 2050, we need a complete change in the way our societies operate. As a result, corporates throughout the world must consider their organization in the value chain so that each of us change the way we produce, we consume, we travel. What are the keys to success? I propose 5 of them. The first one is to feel collectively responsible. Indeed, if we want to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, reduction of carbon emissions must happen at a planetary scale. The accumulation of individual initiatives is good, but will not produce efficient effects if they are not coordinated in terms of timing and intensity. This requires a collective sense of responsibility, far from national protectionism. Climate is a common good, and as such, must be managed in the general interest globally. The second key is exemplarity. It's going to be hard. We have an extremely limited understanding today of the efforts which everyone will have to make. The risk of migration, conflicts in which people will be fighting for their lives, water wars, reduced access to natural resources, threats to health and healthcare systems, all these and more are more than plausible. Exemplarity in our behavior as corporates, as individuals, is key. Third one is reboot our mindset. If we want our children and grandchildren to live in a peaceful world, we, their elders, must prepare it and reverse our mindset to give up comforts, stop creating waste, and go back to greater simplicity. Reconsider values. We need to reconsider our values to accept these lifestyle changes, not as punishment, but rather the pursuit of a new sustainable world. We need to invent a world with slowness versus speed, softness versus harshness, generosity versus egotism. And finally, the fifth key, reinvent the definition of performance. As I said, companies have a crucial role to play. Boards and executives must consider new imperatives and start to operate amidst seemingly contradictory goals because at the same time, deliver decent returns in their operating and financial performances to meet investors' expectations, while responding to all stakeholders to meet the business purpose. But precisely, purpose and performance are not mutually exclusive, far from it. They are not in conflict or opposition with each other at all, provided they are both rooted in sound strategy. Still, there are many obstacles. To achieve this, the impressive objectives designed by the Paris Agreement, there are a couple of obstacles. The first one being, we are human beings, and we know how changing habits takes time, and we have not much time left. Change is easier if there is a promise that things will be better, not harder. We'll have it to make choices. Corporates then should adjust their offering, privileging circular economy, recycling, etc., in an attractive way. Second obstacle, financial markets. Listed companies have been for decades under the dictatorship of investors' expectation for high returns. Quarterly returns in the range of 13–15%. This is no longer sustainable. A new definition must be established which will include, besides financial performances, non-financial achievements, net of negative externalities. Value creation and profit sharing also between shareholders, employees, through increase of wages. Customers should be also revisited with a better balance to reduce inequalities between people. Investors should accept it. This is a complete revolution. Third key, corporates will have to change their business model based on their statement of purpose, raison d'être, assuming this is a genuine commitment by the company to its stakeholders. Business model need to integrate environmental, social, and governance into the strategy. This implies a new way to manage human capital, particularly with remote working, such as the pandemic has ushered in since 2020, and more reliance on IT. This implies also management based on trust and not as vertical as we've been used to it for a long time. The fourth key is the strategy of horizons, as Mark Carney, Governor of the Central Bank of England, stated. This is probably the most important obstacle. The time for awareness should be over now, because it's time for action. Now, not tomorrow. As President Jacques Chirac said at the Johannesburg Summit in 2002, nearly 20 years ago, the house is burning and we are looking over the other side. This is no longer acceptable. And as the recently released report from the International Energy Agency points out, the number of countries announcing pledges to achieve net zero emission over the coming decades continues to grow. But the pledges by government today, even if fully achieved, fall well short of what is required to bring global energy-related carbon emissions to net zero by 2050 and give the world an even chance of limiting the global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. Now, the question is how to do so. Of course, one may think of a supra-regulator imposing global governance to coordinate the whole subject. Personally, I'm doubtful. I rather believe in massive movements of corporate citizens and public opinion, which may impose more coordinated action with the leadership of major business firms to lead the path. Those firms need to prepare now for a sea change in the way they fit in global society, because they will increasingly be required to demonstrate the quality of their strategic thinking over and above their business performance. And they need to prove to societies their ability to think globally and strategically as standard setters to remain global leaders. As a conclusion, this is why board members must challenge and support executives to address, in particular, climate strategy seriously, urgently, thoroughly, comprehensively. It's a question of humanity, responsibility towards our children, safeguarding our planet. My duty as a board member of several French companies is to influence the influencers and raise consciousness to take urgently the appropriate and courageous decisions. Thank you.
Yes, we would like to thank you very much, Eliane Rouillet-Chevalier, for your overview from a board member and also very involved person to push the limit of the sustainability from the decision makers to the end users. And now I'm going to let the floor to my co-chair, Dr. Isabelle Czarnikowski-Loriol, to introduce the next panelist in the pitch voice of citizen.
Yes, we are very pleased to welcome Michel Colombier. Michel is a co-founder and scientific director of the Institute for Sustainable Development and International Relations. He is also a member of France's High Council on the Climate. Michel, the floor is yours. Thank you for joining us for this conference.
Hello. Thanks for inviting me. I'm not sure you can hear me very well. Is it okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
It's okay for the moment?
Yes, we can hear you. So
I'm sorry because I have a problem for connection, but I'm really happy to be in this conference, and it's really fascinating to see the motivation, intelligence, and creativity that was gathered here to develop solutions to the climate change issue. And so once again, it confirms, and what we've heard just now, that success will depend not on a silver bullet, but on a complex arrangement of hard and soft solutions, of high-tech developments and new behavior, of rules of law and markets, and ultimately pragmatic ideas, but also normative values and visions. And in this discussion, it is important, I think, that everybody keeps in mind our common goal and be sure that the set of rules and the governance that we put in place to stimulate innovation, technology adoption, finance deployment, and societal changes are appropriate. And in my view, it's not the case yet. Because, as you may know, the guiding concept of net zero carbon neutrality that Jean Jouzel has referred to, and that we all refer to since its consecration with the Paris Agreement, is at the same time a powerful common tool, but possibly a misleading reference. It is a powerful tool because for the first time, we share a common language to describe the challenge ahead of us, and it's precisely what we've just heard. All countries, municipalities, individuals, and firms can ask themselves, what is my own place in a carbon neutral future? What are the opportunities and risks for me to undertake the transition? But at the same time, what is my responsibility to make it happen? What should I do now, not in the future, now? And for this reason, it creates a governance framework where all agents, public and private in a society, can anticipate, take initiatives, act and move in the same direction beyond the formal top-down hierarchical governance of law. It is not a substitute for law, but a powerful accelerator of action. So I'm very happy with that. But then there's also a rising concern in the scientific community, but not just, regarding the very concept of net zero. And true, It comes as a result of a political process. It's not a scientific concept, but it refers clearly to a set of scientific knowledge that gives us a rather clear picture of the conditions we need to observe between now and 2050 to maintain climate change below 2 degrees. And in a nutshell, the story is the following. First, we should cut emissions from greenhouse gases other than CO2, methane, nitrous oxide, etc., by half or more, which per se is a challenge in the fields of industry and agriculture in the coming 2 decades. Plus, we need to bring down the whole emissions of industry and energy, the whole CO2 emissions of those energy industries close to zero. Plus, the use of land by agriculture, forestry, etc., is today an important source of emission, and we need to turn this sector of human activity into a net absorber, a sink of CO2, about the size of its current level of emission. Plus, we need to develop the capacity to capture and sequester CO2 using technologies that are not yet available. And the amount of this technological sink will depend on the gradient of emission reductions before 2050, meaning that the later we reduce, the more we would need to retire and store soon after. And this has some very practical consequences when it comes to carbon pricing and the use of markets to stimulate the transition. If we really want to deliver the 2-degree objective, we need to deliver on the 4 dimensions at the same time in a consistent and robust manner. And obviously, there is an apparent flexibility in the system between the different domains. One can imagine that, for instance, we can do less on one of them. For instance, we do not reduce as much our energy consumption, and more on other one. For instance, that we can develop more the absorption in forests or whatever. But the important word here is more. If we delay our efforts to reduce energy emissions, we need to ensure now that we will deliver more absorption from the other systems than already required in the reference scenario. This, in an ideal world, we would be able to create the adequate liabilities so that all the consequences of a shift of action, for instance, if you develop more forestry, you may have competition, increased competition between food production and carbon storage. And this, in the ideal world, will be valued by the markets, and you would have a retraction, etc. And so we could trade without limits CO2 emissions from emission reductions foreseeing from action today for action tomorrow. But in the real world, we are not able, at least today, to create such liabilities. And imagine that an industry covered by the European Emission Trading Scheme, which is a liability, although not fully adequate, but close to, imagine that they exchange efforts to reduce emission in their process here in Europe for tree planting elsewhere in the world. Under the current state of play, nobody in the world owns and values the responsibility that this plantation will come in addition to what is necessary in a scenario where the industry actually reduces its emission. And as a consequence, we may just exchange an action here for an action there. In theory also, we could compensate for this in the future. But as it was mentioned just before, this becomes every day less likely as the time to implement the necessary changes is short and shorter every day. Changing energy system, agricultural services, practices, developing sequestration infrastructure at scale takes time, decades, and we just have a few left. And so it is therefore reasonable to consider, in my view, that for the moment, we should keep this domain, this cluster separate, and first work hard to create for both of them the necessary dynamic of change and the liabilities that goes with it. And this in turn has a very concrete consequence on the development of global climate finance, which is key. It will make it effective, efficient, and will avoid a climate bubble crisis in the near future. Because we urgently need more than just divestment. What we need is strategic investment all around the world to support innovative development and make conservative behavior a risky business. which is precisely what the world of finance is good at delivering, providing we give them the right indicators and incentives. If we give them the idea that one can today exchange a wind farm for a forest, we lose. But just giving them a list of brown sectors, such as oil drilling, for instance, and a list of green sectors, such as renewables, PV, or whatever, is far from sufficient. What we need is to develop the right metrics for them to judge at the level of the firm, at the level of the municipality, at the level of the initiative, if the strategy and the action are adequate to survive in the world we want to create. And according to my previous remarks, it means that you have to evaluate first if the firm has a convincing strategy regarding its proposition of value in the future of in the future economy, and consequently the anticipation it makes of changes in the offer of products and services. Second, if the firm has a convincing strategy towards actually bringing down close to zero in the coming 2 decades its emissions, the emissions generated by the production of its products and services at the level of the firm and also in upstream of this production. Plus, this firm needs to make an adequate contribution to the development of sinks according to its current level of emissions, if you want this sink to be developed. And finally, the firm needs to have an adequate strategy to adapt to a changing environment. And if the finance sector can check those 4 parameters, it is extremely useful and necessary. And I think that complying with these rules is, in my view, a necessary condition, not sufficient, but necessary condition to actually deliver the promises of net zero and ultimately achieve the goal of the Paris Agreement. And so the difficulty is not in the net zero concept per se, but in the rules that we are developing to try to implement it. Thank you for the opportunity to share these ideas with you, and also for your own mobilization in the fight against climate change. Thank you.
Yes, indeed. Thanks very much, Michel, for sharing and embedding the pitch voice as citizen and with a science-based evidence approach, and also a broader approach that you have designed to highlight the consciousness that we have all to share. I would like to thank you again, Michel. And now I'm going to have another voice of citizen with me. Just to introduce you very briefly, we do believe that we have to discuss deeper from the boardroom to the young generation and reverse. And I would prefer to to let the floor to my distinguished guest, but not only. She's going to introduce herself better.
Okay, so hi everyone, I'm Sophie Delay, I'm 21, and I am currently a student in a master's degree in international relations and geopolitics. So I'm passionate about political science, but also, of course, with the theme of sustainable development, but also concerned by the new challenges of tomorrow's society. That's why I'm taking the floor today to talk about the next generation of climate representatives. So, as you know, the effects of climate change are occurring in number and intensity all around the world. An increase in temperature. So, as you know, the IPCC report warned of consequences of warming of more than 1.5 degrees. This global warming is linked to greenhouse gas emissions. The latter are emitted by the great power, namely USA and China, which together emit nearly 45% of gases emission. So they generate an increase in drought. This is followed by an increase in natural disasters such as cyclone, flood, melting ice, and rising water level. So this leads to climate migration. More than 140 people could migrate within the whole country by 2015. But also an increase in disease. Thus, if nothing changed and the global crisis keep going on the world will experience epidemic much worse than the COVID-19 we are facing today. It is therefore important to act to reduce GHG at all costs, and young people, more than others, are concerned by the challenges. We are the next one to make society work, and if you don't act now, we and our children and grandchildren will pay heavily for the consequences of climate change. We note that many young people are already aware of climate issues. That's why, following the example of Greta Thunberg and in my country, Camille Chen, many young people are taking matters into their own hands. This done through initiatives such as Friday for the Future and Young Climate. For example, this year I was responsible for the ecological station of a student association. So with my team we organized a Green March. It is a month of awareness on ecology and solidarity themes. So we made different activities such as a green walk, quizzes on the theme on ecology, also a conference given by Camille Chen, and so on. But as young people, we don't all have the opportunity to be part of an association or to act in very committed way. However, at all levels, we can and should try to reduce our carbon footprints as much as possible. And this can be done through various actions in our daily life. If everyone does many of all these things, as much as possible, of course, it will have a positive impact on the planet. So this can be done through our consumption, for example, and our purchasing power. With clothes, for example, as we know, it is the big companies that generate the most greenhouse gases, especially the textile industry, which generates nearly 1.2 billion CO2 per year. But what about it? How can we reduce its impact? The more we stop mass consumption, fast fashion, the less industry will produce. So we can therefore reduce the carbon footprint by buying second-hand clothes on vintage, for example. Also, home appliance. Each electronic device produces a huge impact on the environment. For example, the manufacture on a computer alone requires not less than 240 on fossil fuels. So it is recommended to keep your electronic device as long as possible, ideally for 4 years. And as for clothes, favor second-hand site with refurbished produce. Also, we can have in action as save energy at home on daily basis. Why? Because domestic energy consumption represents nearly 45% of total energy consumption. So the refrigerator, for example, don't take it to the wall. Defrost the fridge every 6 months and don't set it to maximum. These tips that can save a lot of energy. Then you can limit waste consumption and especially plastics by eliminating water bottle, for example, and the manufacture and transportation of plastic bottles are polluting and require oil, which is a non-renewable natural resource and produce a lot of CO2. Mm-hmm. Finally, food. What we eat has a large impact of our carbon footprint and therefore our global warming. So try to eat less meat, starting with less beef. Livestock farming is responsible for more than 40% of GHG emission, as much as oil transformation. This is the first cause of deforestation in the world. And avoid eating industrial and processed food. Their carbon footprint is higher than homemade because they contain many ingredients from all around the world. So you see, it's very simple. Besides, we, young students, by the time we get to the door of responsibility, it will take like 10 or 20 years, but global warming doesn't wait, so we have to act now. And that's why you, entrepreneur, should act now to save our common living spaces, our Earth. So don't wait any longer and act now to save the future.
Yes, indeed. I would like to thank you, Sophie, for being a partner of this organization, for also driving forces for the new generation, and also driving forces internext generation. This specific panel, our specific pitch voice of citizen, is a real intergeneration task force, powered from the younger one to the track record one. So I would like to thank you again,
Thank you,
Sophie, for doing this, and to share also it for all the audiences, and hope that you have understand, Sophie. Now it's the time to act. Thanks, and we're going to be back soon with a smart break, or it could be a coffee break or tea break as usual, and just to be back soon in very few minutes for this.
So it is now the time of closing remarks and our messages to COP26. We had very intense 2 days with many discussions. We were able to share views, and this will contribute to fit the COP26. As you know, there are high expectations for COP26. It will be 6 years after the COP21 in Paris, where for the first time a global agreement was reached to limit global warming well below 2 degrees Celsius. The goals for COP26, in order to face the climate crisis, which is worsening, are of four categories. There are 4 goals. The first one is to secure global net zero by mid-century and keep 1.5 degrees C within reach. Countries are being asked to come forward with ambitious 2030 emissions reduction targets that align with this goal. We have discussed during these 2 days of conference on a range of innovative technologies to deliver beyond pledges on this ambitious target. We see that we need to encourage investments in all innovative technologies. We also saw that CCUS, carbon capture, utilization and storage, is one of them. It is a perfect example of climate tech, as it was developed for combating climate change and nothing else. It is a carbon sink. But we need all technologies, and each country, each territory has to set up the best combination of technologies tailored to their needs and to their specificities. The second objective of COP26 is to mobilize finance from the private and public sectors. During these 2 days of carbon pricing conference, we have discussed on carbon pricing and financial tools to enable appropriate investments for facing the climate crisis and the green revolution. States have a strong and central role to play, in particular for investing on new capital-intensive technologies and infrastructures, and to set up efficient public-private partnerships. The third goal of the COP26 that will take place in Glasgow in November is to work together to deliver. We can only address the challenges of the climate crisis by working together. We have discussed during these 2 days of carbon pricing conference how we could accelerate action to tackle the climate crisis through collaboration between government, industry, the financial community, businesses, and civil society. And the fourth goal of the COP26 is to adapt, to protect communities and natural habitats, protect and restore ecosystems. And during the carbon pricing conference, we tackled also the issue of biodiversity, and we showed how climate change and biodiversity are closely connected. So personally, I learned a lot during these 2 days. I guess it is the same for all of you. Let's digest quickly all we have learned and shared, and let's all take appropriate actions and decisions in our daily jobs and as citizens. We are all in the same boat. Climate is a common good. Thank you for participating, and we will come back at 6 p.m. for the Climate Award ceremony. It will be very exciting. With Fabrice, we invite you to join this ceremony, and have a nice break, and see you very soon at 6 p.m.
Yes, let's back very soon at 6 p.m. Paris time zone. And to complete very briefly with my co-chair of CPC, that all the piece of work we have drive and push forward on the different sessions will be a piece of contribution to the COP26, indeed, with the convergence with the biodiversity asset, the new core asset to converge with climate issues. And the piece of work will be highlighted to the chairman of the COP26, Alok Sharma, and his steering committee. So keep tuned for the work, as a piece of work we drive on the table and to highlight next for Glasgow. For this next round, let's back very soon for the Climate Tech Awards. Cheers.
Cheers.